Chapter 17 of Four Mothers at Chautauqua by Pansy. This recording is in the public domain. Common. Hazel waited for no breakfast. As soon as it was possible for her to escape, she fled to her attic and threw herself upon her cot, where the hornets and mice, if they had been at home, could have borne witness to such an outburst of tears and sobs and exclamations of indignation and distress as that attic must seldom have heard. Mingled with her bitter indignation was an almost overwhelming sense of shame at the thought that she had appeared to others as without self-respect, as bold, as everything that her aunt included in that one hateful word, common. Perhaps she ought not to have taken that little walk to the shore, though other girls did such things. She had met dozens of them walking and chatting with young men. Still, they might have been old friends, while he was a stranger. Yet he didn't seem so. He seemed like the kindest friend any one could have. Was it possible that he too thought her common? Had he urged her to come to the south side of the amphitheater that evening because he knew that he could? That she could be coaxed to do what other girls, respectable girls with fathers and mothers, would not do? Poor Hazel! She did not believe it, she believed him to be true and noble and good. Nevertheless, the thought rankled. There was also another misery. She had broken her pledge. Aunt Sarah had been horrid, perfectly horrid and mean. But so had she. She had said things that ought not to have been said. They might be true, she believed that they were, but no girl pledged to strive always for the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit ought to have soiled her soul by speaking them. It is good to be able to record that, before that dreadful first hour in the attic was ended, this girl so tried, so miserable, so true at heart, slipped to her knees and sobbed out her troubles and her confessions to the ear of him who has promised rest. Nevertheless, she did not fully rest. She was young and foolish. Like many an older Christian, she insisted on picking up part of the burden again, and carrying it about with her. Before noon, a kind of peace had been patched up between her aunt and herself. She had gone, with her eyes red and her face swollen with weeping, and faltered out some stumbling regrets for words that ought not to have been uttered, and her aunt had tried to be kind. She assured her that of course she had not for a moment believed her to be intentionally bad. If she had not at once flown into a passion, she would have understood that they were simply frightened at finding her so hopelessly ignorant of the world, and heedless of its dangers. Why, her cousins were appalled at the idea of her walking and driving about with an unknown man. One thing she had certainly proved, she was not to be trusted alone on these grounds. Hereafter she must go out with one of them, or not at all. As for the man who had insulted her, there was no question as to his badness. Men understood about these things, if some girls did not. Let him come in her neighborhood if he dared. She would very soon see that he was sent about other business. If he had presumed upon the notion that Hazel had no one to protect her, he would find himself mistaken. It cannot be said that Hazel was comforted by this interview. She came away feeling herself almost certainly common. As the day waned, her humiliation deepened. Life had suddenly lost all its charm. She thought gloomily of the ball game which she had intended to watch. She wanted no ball game. She wanted nothing of any of them. If only she could get away and go to Mother! Oh, if she could! Mother would understand. She cried at intervals throughout the long day, surreptitiously in the early part of it, with absolute abandon when the work was done and she had drawn down shades and made the little annex look deserted, and then gone to swelter in her attic. The rooms below were deserted. The girls, after vainly trying to persuade her to join them in going to the ball ground, offering to "do the dishes" if she would, had departed with half a dozen acquaintances, and her aunt, after urging the special features of interest at the 4 o'clock missionary rally, offering to wait for her if she would go, and assuring her that they would all get supper together when they came home, had finally gone away vexed, telling her as a parting message that if she preferred to sulk rather than to act like a reasonable being, she could have that privilege. Hazel did not sulk, but she cried as she had never in all her troubles cried before. The utter impossibility of explaining to either aunt or cousins just how she felt, weighed on her like a pall, their very kindness pressing it the more closely. By evening, when outward calm had again been achieved, eyes and face told their unmistakable tale. She went to bed as soon as she had finished the supper dishes, Josephine insisting on helping with them and chatting to her cheerfully about the wonders of the ball game. Then, "Won't you go hear Mrs. McCoy? People say she is very good." Hazel, by this time almost too much exhausted, physically, to talk, could honestly say that she would rather go to bed than anywhere else in the world. On Sunday she did not have to feign headache as an excuse to remain invisible all day. She had one that kept her a prisoner. Again they were kind. Isabel hovered over her, bathing her head with witch hazel, while Josephine tried to make the attic look less dreary; and her aunt called up from the foot of the stairs that they were to be sure and have Hazel come down and lie on her couch; it was so much cooler there. But Hazel would not. She was thankful that the day was cool, and that she could honestly say the attic was comfortable, and she would not stir from it for anything. She protested earnestly and successfully against the offer of each one to stay and minister to her. She would not have them lose the baccalaureate's sermon for the world. She drew a long sigh of relief when at last they departed, and fought her way alone through a day of physical and mental pain. She was almost glad when her head ached so hard that she could neither think nor cry any more. The next morning, despite the headache which still continued through in a subdued form, Hazel plunged into work with an energy that augured well for Isabel's white dress which she had offered to launder, and persisted in undertaking. In truth, she added to the regular Monday routine all the extras she could, with a half frightened feeling that it was only by working to exhaustion that she could manage to live. By Tuesday morning the girl looked so white and worn, and had such heavy black rings under her eyes, that Josephine resolved to interfere. "Mother," she began with firmness, "don't you think it is going to be impossible to keep Hazel in this little tucked-up house all the time, unless she goes out with us? A girl of spirit would be sure to resent such a thing anyway. She wants to feel free to go and come when she likes, of course, as the rest of us do. I think it is all nonsense about not trusting her. Now that she understands, she will be careful enough. And anyhow, she does as she is told, wonderfully well." Mrs. Bradford looked annoyed, as she generally did when her daughters called her ways in question, and told what they thought. But before she could reply, Isabel, more diplomatic than her sister, put in her word. "She looks dreadful this morning, as though she had had a fit of sickness or was going to. We'll have her sick on our hands next, and father flying up here to attend to us all. Wouldn't it be horrid to have somebody real sick in a little tucked up place like this?" Then Josephine added, "Do, Mother, send her on an errand somewhere. The air is delicious, just a walk in it will do her good. She won't go out with us. I tried to get her to go to the class with me this morning, but I couldn't." Mrs. Bradford felt like saying that if the silly girl chose to be so obstinate, she might stay home forever for all her. But that reference to Mr. Bradford and his anxieties checked her. Besides, the child really looked miserable. What if she should sulk herself into genuine illness? On the whole, Mrs. Bradford decided to ignore former commands, and began as soon as Hazel entered with a fresh supply of milk. "Hazel, if you are through your breakfast, I wish you would run to the office with those letters on my table. I want your uncle's to go by the early mail. You'll have to get me a quarter's worth of stamps, too, and put some on the letters. I'm entirely out. You'll find a quarter in my purse in the left-hand drawer." In this way it came about that Burnham Roberts, moodily waiting for change at the money order window, gave a sudden exclamation and, forgetting his change, rushed over to the window where Hazel was waiting for stamps. He had almost given up the hope of meeting her by any of the ordinary ways. There was unmistakable eagerness in his greeting. "Good morning. Where have you been for this long time? Why did you go back on me in such a cruel fashion when I begged you to let me show you the ball game? And why weren't you out all day Sunday? You have been ill," he added hastily and anxiously as she turned startled eyes upon him. She glanced about her nervously. For all that she knew she might be doing something very common at this moment. Who was there on the watch to make note of it? She felt as though she ought to rush away without a word, but the postage stamps must be waited for, and there were several others to be served before her. "I could not come," she said, her voice low and tremulous, "and I must not talk with you. Oh, no," replying to another anxious question, "I am not ill, I am only miserable." "What is it?" he asked with increasing earnestness and increasing gentleness. "What has happened? Something I see that troubles you very much. Am I in any way to blame? What can I do? Are you waiting for letter stamps? I have some. Let me stamp and mail those letters, then we will walk to some quiet place where you can tell me all about it." She held to the letters and spoke almost as if in terror. "No, oh no, indeed I must not. I cannot walk with you any more, nor talk with you. I must go at once. My aunt is— oh, Mr. Roberts, please, I cannot tell you anything." She did not mean to. Afterwards she did not understand how it was that she had. He was not insistent. He did not try to take the letters, nor to do anything contrary to her wish. But he questioned her gently, ingenuously, while he was taking the stamps from her trembling fingers and affixing them to her letters. She was sure that she did not tell him much, not anything like the whole dreadful story; yet he seemed to understand. When, after a very few minutes, he held open the door for her to pass, himself remaining behind, all he said was, "I shall see you soon. Good bye until then." To himself he said, as he stood looking after the girl, "The old cat, the insufferable old cat. If I don't get even with you, my name is not Burnham Roberts." It is quite safe to infer that he was not speaking of Hazel. Before noon he did, what he had done all his life when he reached a place of straits and was not sure which way to turn, went in search of his mother. He chose his words with diplomacy. "Mommy, do you know that you and I have succeeded in getting your little friend into a sea of trouble? It seems that it is not safe, in this hotbed of gossip, to bestow ordinary courtesies on acquaintances." They were in his mother's dressing room, and she turned wondering eyes on him from the mirror before which she was arranging her hair. "What do you mean, Burnham? Which of my friends is in trouble?" "The latest one," he said lightly. "The little girl we took driving. Afterwards I had the audacity to provide a seat for her in the amphitheater, moreover, I met her on the street and walked a few squares with her; and it seems her aunt is a person of very limited brains and large imagination. She chooses to think that her niece has not only made some objectionable acquaintances, but has been too familiar with them; and the child is now practically a prisoner in that twopenny annex where we found her." "The idea!" said Mrs. Roberts. "The poor child! And I was just planning a way to have her with us for part of tomorrow, so as to give her a better chance to see the procession and all the other functions." "Glad to hear it," said her son, speaking gaily. "I have a great desire to see that remarkable aunt meet her match, and experience tells me that what Mrs. Evan Roberts plans she will likely carry out, regardless of ignorant persons who think they can hinder." What mother but would be pleased with such a word from her son? Mrs. Roberts smiled, and knew that she would certainly try to carry out her plans. It was this chain of events that caused Mrs. Bradford to be flying about her room that afternoon in frantic haste to make certain changes in her toilet that she had not meant to make so early. A little girl rooming in the cottage of which Mrs. Bradford's rooms were an annex, had heard and answered a knock at the side porch door, and carried to that lady a card that she had long coveted, bearing engraved on it the name, Mrs. Evan Roberts. Mrs. Bradford knew that it would forever hereafter grace her parlor table. She was practically alone in the house; her daughters were away for the afternoon, and Hazel had retired to her attic, where knocks at lower doors were not heard. So the hostess arrived at last on the side porch, where in pleasant weather her callers were received, breathless from haste and profuse with apologies for keeping her guest waiting. This gave the caller time to recover from her surprise and readjust her possible program for the interview. Behold, the obnoxious aunt that her son had deftly challenged her to conquer, was the wife of her husband's head bookkeeper! She had met the lady before, and believed that she understood something of her character. Her hasty mental comment was, "That poor child! Now I understand something that puzzled me." Rapidly she reconstructed her mode of approach, and presently broke in upon Mrs. Bradford's rapture over receiving a call at last from her "dear friend," with a quiet, "Part of my errand this afternoon was to see your niece, whom I met a few days ago. Is she at home, and may I have the pleasure of a little visit with her?" Then was Mrs. Bradford all but overwhelmed. So that sly girl had actually come in contact with Mrs. Evan Roberts, and said not a word about it! When had they met, and how? Had Mrs. Roberts heard of the gossip that was no doubt afloat? If so, how should she find out how much or how little had been heard, and what attitude toward it should she take with the great lady? She was visibly disturbed, and her guest, pitying her embarrassment, essayed to explain. Chapter 18 of Four Mothers at Chautauqua by Pansy. Dilemmas. I presume she has told you of making the acquaintance of my dear friend, Mrs. Burnham, who brought her home from the shore the day she was not feeling well? It was through Mrs. Burnham that I met her. I became interested in her at once; one cannot help being interested in young girls. Soon afterwards I called, and finding her at home alone, carried her with me for a little drive into the country. I hope you have forgiven me for running away with a member of your family." She was aiming to put her hostess at ease, but had simply added astonishment to her embarrassment. So this was the lady in the back seat with Hazel when she was seen driving out with a strange young man. If Mrs. Bradford had only known! What mattered it who the young man was, since he was with Mrs. Evan Roberts? Still, despite a little flurry of indignation, Mrs. Bradford was relieved. Part of her annoyance over Hazel's supposed departure from the ways of propriety was born of genuine anxiety for the girl. She honestly believed that Hazel in her ignorance had fallen a prey to the wiles of a bad man. To find that he was a man for whom Mrs. Evan Roberts was ready to vouch was a very great relief; and to realize that it was Mrs. Roberts who had invited Hazel to drive, of course because she knew her to be her niece, was a joy almost too great to be believed. Having been genuinely disturbed, the relief brought her to the verge of tears and bewildering exclamations. "Oh, my dear Mrs. Roberts, how shall I tell you what a load you have taken from my heart? I have been so distressed, and so uncertain what steps to take. Being away from my husband with the responsibility thrown on me, of course I felt it all the more. You know how necessary it is for a young girl to see to it that her good name is kept intact, and my poor niece had not, I am sorry to say, the kind of early training that would make her careful. When I heard that she had been out driving with a young man, a total stranger, whose name, even, I was unable to discover, you may judge how I felt. The child is naturally so secretive that she did not even mention the drive to me, much less your name. Had I for a single moment supposed you to be connected with it, I should have understood, of course, and all my anxieties would have been over. As it is, I am sure you can realize what I have suffered, for of course you know what gossip is." Mrs. Roberts was not sure of any such thing. Certain of this woman's phrases bewildered her. "Do you mean me to understand," she asked quietly, "that your niece has been the subject of unpleasant gossip, and that my son with whom I was driving out that afternoon has been the innocent cause?" "Why, you see," began Mrs. Bradford, embarrassed again as she saw to what such an understanding might lead. "I hadn't the remotest idea, as I told you, that your name was associated with it in any way. Hazel told me nothing. She is by nature so secretive that there seems to be no use in trying to win her confidence. I have to depend upon others. And this is what came to me." Here she leaned forward, and dropping into undertone, gave an elaborate account of Hazel's supposed indiscretions, and the distress of her aunt and cousins. "I am sorry, indeed," said Mrs. Roberts when the story was concluded, "that my effort to give pleasure to a little girl whose face and manner I fancied, should have led to unpleasant comments. I shall have to confess that it all seems very simple and commonplace to me. The instincts of gentlemen prompt certain attentions to ladies of their acquaintance, of course, but such do not as a rule furnish food for gossip. Still, I can see how you as a guardian felt the need for being even more than careful. Our misfortune was not in having met any other members of the family on the day that I called for your niece to drive with me." "Yes, indeed," began Mrs. Bradford eagerly. "If I had only known—" She launched forth on an earnest reiteration of her ignorance of the Roberts name as associated with the matter, and the potency of it, if she had but known; to all of which Mrs. Roberts gave slight heed; her mind being busy with the problem of how, under the circumstances, she could best proceed with her scheme. Mrs. Bradford, too, was thinking, almost as fast as she talked. The problem with her was how further to present her niece's story to this woman who represented power. If Mr. Bradford could secure an addition to his salary, a large addition, because of the coming of another member into his family to be fed and clothed, it would be what she, Mrs. Bradford, had long believed ought to be done. Why should she not, having an unprecedented opportunity, talk from that standpoint? The diplomatist decided to undertake it. Since Mrs. Roberts was so interested in Hazel, it was right that she should know all about her. The poor child was left penniless and destitute; she might almost say utterly destitute. She had not even decent clothing when she came to them more than a year ago after the death of both her parents. There had barely been money enough scraped together to pay her traveling expenses from the Pacific coast. The child's father was—well, he was a painter. Mrs. Roberts knew what improvident people they generally were. Oh, no, not a house painter, no indeed. If he had been that, he could possibly have made a decent living for his family. He called himself an artist, and really sold a good many pictures at one time, but they traveled a great deal, always taking the poor child with them, and wasting their money and her opportunities, for while she had been all over the world, one might say, she had never stayed long enough in one place to be taught anything useful. When the father died, there were debts that swallowed up what little they had. Oh, it was a distressing tale, and what they had been through, Mrs. Bradford would not harrow the soul of her guest by trying to describe. Suffice it to say that they sent for the girl, of course, and helped her to get to them, and were doing the best for her that they could. But Mrs. Roberts knew how expensive living in New York was, for poor people, and the truth was that since Hazel's coming it had been hard work sometimes to make ends meet. When she, Mrs. Bradford, had planned for this outing in the country, she had done it at infinite sacrifice, chiefly on Mr. Bradford's account. He did so need a complete change. But behold, he had not been able to come at all. It was wonderful what difference it made to have one more to feed and clothe, to say nothing of traveling expenses. Still, Mr. Bradford had borne it all with cheerfulness. Hazel was the child of his half brother only, and they had been separated when quite young, but he felt that he must treat her just as he did his own; and they were doing it, although of course it was at the expense of sacrifice. And there was nothing but sacrifice, so far; for Hazel had not been trained to helpfulness in any line, even about the duties of a quiet home. Mrs. Roberts, if she was at all interested in such matters, would be amazed to see how ignorant a young girl could be. She was trying to teach her, of course, what all girls should know, but it was a hindrance rather than help; still they were not working for reward, and they meant to do their little best for her. It was a masterly plea, and to some of it Mrs. Roberts had listened with interest, even asking questions to draw out further details, as she began to see how the story would further her own plans; but her response was not in line with the narrator's hopes. "I am glad you have told me this," she said, when Mrs. Bradford at last reached a period, "because it opens the way for a little plan of mine that may be a temporary help to us both. We have in our party this summer a number of little children, 4 grandchildren of mine, and 4 or 5 others belonging to very dear friends. They all play together, and we have been looking for a suitable person to take direction of their plays and walks for 2 or 3 hours each day. Would you be willing to lend us your niece for this purpose, during the remainder of your stay on the grounds, provided of course that she is willing to come?" Without waiting for reply, she hastened to add particulars. "Although we should want only 2 or at most 3 hours of help each day, we should want the time divided in such a way that the only convenient plan would be to have her remain with us so as to be within call when needed. It would therefore be right to pay for more than the 2 or 3 hours of service. If you will lend her to me for the next few weeks, I will give her room and board, and $10 a week. That will enable her to furnish a few trifles for her own wardrobe. Girls always like that, you know." Then was Mrs. Bradford in a dilemma. What was she to say? She had already carefully explained that Hazel was rather a hindrance than a help to her, so excuses of that kind were cut off. Moreover, she was aware that $10 a week was very unusual payment for the service required, and none knew better than she how many trifles it could be made to buy. But, and here, the lady being at her wits' ends, determined to flee to the exact truth. "That is certainly a very generous offer, but I am afraid, my dear Mrs. Roberts, that my husband's peculiar ideas will prevent its acceptance. For a plain business man I shall have to confess that he has some sentimental and expensive ideas. Loyalty to his brother, although he was only a half brother, has taken hold of him to such an extent that he simply will not hear of Hazel's being set at anything that we would not plan for our own daughters; so the idea of her going out to any sort of service had simply to be abandoned. Personally, I believe that it is the worker who dignifies the work, and that whatever a truly self-respecting person is willing to do will not in any true sense injure her. But one cannot run contrary to the prejudices of one's husband, you know." How amazed would Mrs. Bradford's daughters have been had they heard these lofty deliverances from her lips! Yet Mrs. Bradford believed that she believed them. Her caller smiled indulgently. She had recognized a quotation from one of the leading speakers of the Woman's Club. "It is an interesting subject for discussion," she said. "But fortunately we do not have to enter into it now. We have simply to remember that we are at Chautauqua, where peculiar conditions prevail. The waiters at many of the large boarding houses, you know, are college girls and boys, who know that they do not in any way imperil their social positions by taking up this summer work. The word servant is not thought of in their connection. Not that it isn't a good word; I would be honored in hearing it applied to myself, in the same way that Paul used it." The last phrase was added in response to Mrs. Bradford's look of bewilderment. But it did not especially enlighten her. The poor lady was too busy securing her social position to have time for great familiarity with Paul's letters. "That is the trouble," she murmured, her mind still on the word "servant" in the sense that it was familiar to her. "It is a word that sticks, and some people, as you say, are foolish, and so—" Mrs. Roberts interrupted. "I mean, of course, to include your niece as a member of my family. We have a family table at the hotel where she would have a seat with us." Mrs. Bradford's face cleared, and her heart experienced a sharp twinge of envy. What an opportunity this might be for Josephine or Isabel! She could hear herself explaining to her few Chautauqua friends, "My daughter has gone to spend a few days with our dear friend Mrs. Roberts at the Athenaeum. Mrs. Evan Roberts, you know, of New York. They are in straits, of course, about help; such people always are; and as my daughter is passionately fond of children, she has offered to keep the younger ones of their party in sight when they go to walk, and see that they don't get drowned or run over. It gives her walks a definite object, you know. She was very glad to be able to help them out." It sounded well. She resolved to venture. "That is really a very tempting offer, dear Mrs. Roberts, for a girl who needs to earn money. If Hazel, who I am sorry to say has inherited from her mother some false ideas, should be too proud to accept it, I am sure that either of my daughters would be glad to help you. They are both delightful with children, and are so anxious to help their father with his heavy financial burdens that I am in constant fear lest they will do something rash that should bring in a little money. It would really be a relief to have one of them safe with you for a few days." It was well done, but Mrs. Roberts was not caught. "Such desires are a credit to your daughters," she said kindly. "But my youngest grandchild has fallen in love with your niece, and as she is a shy little creature, slow to make acquaintance, I do not think I shall try for any one else during this short time, if Hazel will not come to us. May I see her, Mrs. Bradford?" Mrs. Bradford decided to try the truth again. "I will see if she is in. But, dear Mrs. Roberts, I am afraid she could not go to the hotel just now, even if she wanted to. To be entirely frank, her wardrobe is not in condition to leave home. I have had so many expenses, and such unexpected ones since coming here, that the ready-made garments suitable for the country which I intended to buy for her as soon as we reached the grounds, have had to wait until my husband can send us another remittance." Even that did not silence Mrs. Roberts. She arose as she spoke. "That need not trouble you if Hazel is willing. I shall be glad to advance a portion of her salary and let her make the necessary purchases at once. One comfort in being in the country lies, I think, in the fact that we need only simple, easily laundered garments. It happens that my daughter is going to Jamestown to morrow afternoon, and she would be glad to undertake any commissions. She is an excellent shopper. I depend on her for my own needs. May I see Miss Hazel a moment?" "Miss Hazel, indeed!" muttered Mrs. Bradford, as she toiled up the steep and narrow stairs in search of her niece. Chapter 19 of Four Mothers at Chautauqua by Pansy. This recording is in the public domain. We'll do it together. However, before she reached the top stair she had decided that perhaps, under the circumstances, this was the best that could have happened. The Roberts family would certainly not feel at liberty to spend very much of the salary on clothes, and a few clothes Hazel must have at once. The girls were simply insistent about that. The more she thought of it, the more she felt that it might be providential. Mrs. Bradford was never quite sure on that point. If there was gossip afloat, it would be a great thing to have the protection of Mrs. Evan Roberts. "Dear Mrs. Roberts has taken such a fancy to my niece that we are really almost jealous. She is staying with them now, helping a little in the care of the children; in the interval between nurses, you know. Oh, she is well acquainted with them. She has been out driving with the family." She heard herself explaining to the curious after some such fashion. perhaps to those who had tried to gossip, she liked the sound of it. Moreover, what an entering wedge to intimacy with the Roberts family it might be, later, to have Hazel so well acquainted with them. She would tell her that she would better accept the offer. It was her full intention to superintend the interview between Mrs. Roberts and her niece, but possibly Providence arranged otherwise. It appeared that the owner of the cottage had been visiting her attic, and was waiting at that moment to have an interview with her tenant about an important matter. Hazel had already started to summon her aunt for the purpose, and met her at the head of the stairs. There was just time to explain hurriedly the nature of Mrs. Roberts' errand, and to urge acceptance on the ground that the salary would relieve her uncle, at least a little, in his difficult task of supporting them all, when the lady appeared and claimed her attention. Hazel whisked past them, and flew down those narrow and treacherous stairs like a winged creature. Could Mrs. Bradford have heard the opening words of that interview below stairs, she would have been less certain of the providential element. "Dear child, what have you been doing to yourself? You look positively ill." "Oh, I'm not ill. I've been having a perfectly terrible time, and have cried ever so much. That is what is the matter with my eyes." Then Mrs. Roberts, watch in hand, said tenderly, "Poor little girl, I want to hear all about that perfectly terrible time as soon as I can. But just now I must talk very fast. I am late for an appointment. Has your aunt told you that I want to run away with you for a little? Will you come to us, dear, and help us with the children for a few days?" Hazel's tear-swollen eyes flashed joy at that, and to cover emotion that evidently lay near the surface, she clasped her hands in an extravagance of delight, murmuring in tragic tones, "Oh, Mrs. Roberts, will I spend a few days in heaven?" Mrs. Roberts laughed appreciatively. "The Athenaeum is far from being heaven, dear, although it is a very good hotel. Then I may send for you this evening, may I not? Your aunt and I have made all the arrangements about that important matter of clothes, so they need not delay you, and there are special reasons why I want you for to-morrow. Now I really must run. I have quite overstayed the time that was at my disposal, and it is shocking in me to be late." Then, because she was a little woman, she stood on tiptoe to kiss Hazel's glowing cheek as she said, "You and I will have some quiet talks together, dear." It was early on the following morning that a number of guests at the hotel were gathered on one of the verandas waiting for the summons to breakfast, and watching the gambols of a group of children on the lawn. Little white-robed fairies flitting about a central figure, a young girl in a freshly laundered white dress that had become too small for her, and was worn and darned in several places. But the defects were skillfully hiding under a ribbon here and a flower there, and the whole effect was of girlish grace and winsomeness. She sat on a rustic seat under a great tree, and was deftly weaving a flower wreath for one of the children who waited to be crowned. Other babies were clamoring for like service. "One at a time," the girl said brightly. "There shall be a wreath for each of you before the day is done, but we must crown Marjorie first, because she is to be a flower girl, you know." "And me next," piped up a shrill voice, "because I'm to sing at the concert." "Oh, yes, of course. Our 4 singers must be crowned. Sing a verse of your song for me while I work." Instantly they formed in line, the 4 important ones who had part in the children's cantata to be given that afternoon, and their shrill little voices rang out in song. "The sun was shining on the sea, shining with all his might. He did his very best to make the billows smooth and bright, and this was odd because it was the middle of the night." "It's an awfully silly song," one singer paused to criticize, "'cause the sun doesn't shine at all in the night." "The moon does," shouted the little one standing next. "Let's sing the moon verse." Forthwith they sang, "The moon was shining sulkily because she thought the sun had got no business to be there after the day was done. It's very rude of him," she said, "to come and spoil the fun. The sea was wet as wet could be, the sands were dry as dry. You couldn't see a cloud because no cloud was in the sky. No birds were flying overhead, there were no birds to fly. "What utter nonsense to teach to children!" exclaimed Eureka Harrison, who was among the company on the veranda. "So it is," admitted a lady standing near her, "but it is from the cantata that is to be given this afternoon, Lewis Carroll's absurd story of 'The Walrus and the Carpenter,' you know. Have you heard it? It's ridiculously funny and charming. How well those children sing it! Who is the girl who is training them?" "Her name is Hazel Harris," Eureka said briefly. Then a lady at her elbow volunteered information. "She is a new nurse girl, I think. At least I know that some of the mothers have been looking for help, and she has been around with those children all the morning. She is very pretty, isn't she, and graceful." At that moment Burnham Roberts left the post against which he was leaning, and moved to the side of the one who had first questioned. "I beg your pardon, Miss Woodbury," he said. "Did I hear you asking about the young lady on the lawn with the children? She is Miss Harris of New York, a friend of my mother. She has come to help us look after those little terrors down there for a few days in the absence of their nurse." When he reached Eureka's side a moment afterwards, he had a word for her ear alone. "I happen to know that my mother is anxious that Miss Harris shall not be mistaken for an ordinary nurse girl, because she is with the children. Of course you will help us in correcting any such absurd impression." "I shall not go around telling it, if that is what you mean," she answered coldly, "though I fail to see what particular harm such an impression could do." "It is not true," he said, speaking with more sharpness than the occasion seemed to her to require. "Falseness always does harm." Then their attention was diverted to the scene on the lawn. Other children had arrived and were trying to get close to Miss Harris, to the discomfort of one small boy who was shouting fiercely to another a trifle older than himself. "You keep away! You can't have her!" "I can too!" "You can't have her, not one teenty taunty! She's ours!" "She ain't either!" "She is too, she belongs to just us 9. Mamma said so." "Teddy," called Burnham Roberts in a tone of authority, "hold on there, little chap, don't be rude." "Well, but, Uncle Burnham, Miss Harris is just ours. Mamma said so, and Grandma did too." "That's all right, Teddy, hold on to her forever, but don't forget that you are a gentleman." His next words were for Eureka in complacent tones. "That mother of mine is a genius." He was still gazing down upon the ever moving group below. Eureka's eyes followed his. So far as she could discover, no mother was in sight. "I don't feel disposed to challenge the statement," she said, "but I fail to see the connection." He laughed cheerfully. "I was thinking of Miss Harris and the masterly way in which my mother accomplished the impossible. Do you know that the child is the victim of a belligerent and otherwise objectionable aunt who was making life miserable for her? But yesterday my mother alighted down upon them like a visitor from another world and spirited the child away without commotion or jar of any sort; without even antagonizing the aunt. She created, while she talked with her, a field of usefulness for the niece that served as an excuse, and accomplished it all within an hour's time. Isn't that evidence of genius?" "It is evidence of idiocy," muttered Eureka, but not until she had turned away from Burnham, and had only herself for a listener. Pursuing the same train of thought an hour later, she gave a less harsh version of it to Mrs. Dennis. "With all due deference to Aunt Flossy's loveliness and general fascinations, don't you think she is sometimes a bit of a goose?" "Flossy!" said Mrs. Dennis, surprised. "I haven't had such a thought for a great many years. On the contrary, I think her a wonderfully wise little woman, as a rule. What has she done to suggest such a dreadful idea?" "Oh, I don't mean anything very dreadful," Eureka said with a little laugh. "I agree with you as a rule. I'm as fond of Aunt Flossy as any person can be, but all the same I think she has been rather foolish in bringing that Harris girl here. She must know as well as we do that her son simply can't resist the charm of a new and pretty face, and when kittenish manners are added, as they are in this case, he is hopeless, for a few hours. Why doesn't she protect the girl from the inevitable, if she really wants to help her? That's what I don't understand." Mrs. Dennis gave Eureka's face, that was only partially turned toward her, a sudden searching look before she made any response. Then she said, "You are thinking only of the child? You have no fear of the effect on Burnham?" Eureka drew herself up almost as though the question were personal. "Not the slightest," she said, turning bright, keen eyes fully upon the questioner. "Aunt Marian, how can you possibly ask such a question when you know him so well? There was never a man better able to take care of himself than Burnham Roberts; but that makes one all the more anxious for the girl. He simply doesn't mean anything at all; but how is she to know that before it is too late for her happiness?" They were interrupted before other words could be spoken; but Mrs. Dennis, who, a little later, was waiting for her party in one of the small reception rooms and thinking over Eureka's outburst, began unconsciously to hum the words of the children's moon verse: "The sun was shining sulkily because she thought the sun had got no business to be there after the day was done. It's very rude of her," she said, "to come and spoil the fun." The only other occupant of the room was her brother-in-law, the missionary from Utah. He lowered the morning paper at which he was glancing and looked at her curiously. "Has much music gone to your brain?" he asked. "Else why this remarkable selection?" She laughed shamefacedly. "I must have been thinking aloud," she said. "I didn't realize that I was singing. It is the children's moon song, and there is a great deal of human nature in it. I have just been having an interview with the moon while she was acting that very part, and didn't know it." By this time Burnham Roberts had departed with his mother and Hazel to secure the best possible position for viewing the morning's doings. The great day of the Chautauqua season, known to the initiated as "Recognition Day," had arrived. "But I am to stay with the children," Hazel had said, her eyes wide with surprise as immediately after breakfast Mrs. Roberts made her acquainted with the program. "Not to day," was the smiling answer. "The children's mothers are anxious that you should see the sights this morning. They think you may not have an opportunity again to see so unique a procession. The children will be well cared for. Their Aunt Eureka says that all she wants of the day is Earl Barnes's address, so she has engaged to keep them within calling distance until Norah is at liberty." "That is precisely like you," had been Burnham Roberts' undertone comment to Eureka when he heard of this arrangement. "You can always be relied upon for doing the unexpected, and the thoroughly kind and unselfish thing. We'll do it together this time. I'm going to give the little girl the day of her life." "You are going to begin the misery of her life," Eureka thought, but did not say. She watched the three move gaily down the hill to the time of the chiming bells; Mrs. Roberts being apparently as care-free and ready for pleasure as was the young girl beside her; watched them with gloomy eyes. Why didn't that little mother see what she was doing? The "time of her life" indeed! If somebody could only warn the poor girl! "Instead of which I offered to help so that we could do it together." The laugh with which the soliloquy closed had in it a touch of bitterness. This girl was by no means certain that she relished the lifelong program that she believed was mapped out for herself, yet her uppermost thought that morning was, pity for the little idiot who was marching gaily to her doom. Chapter 20 of Four Mothers at Chautauqua by Pansy. Sing Paeans over the Past. They were right about Hazel. She had never before seen, never imagined a prettier sight than that procession led by 100 little girls robed in white, wreathed in flowers, and with baskets of flowers in their tiny hands. They were so fascinating that for a time she had eyes only for them. Burnham had made a short cut ahead of the main procession, which brought them presently within view of the Golden Gate and the evergreen arches. This was Hazel's first sight of them, and her questions came rapidly. Burnham Roberts, whose first act had been to find a seat for his mother within full view of the hall and with several of her friends, had returned to Hazel bristling with information. He had taken the utmost pains to make ready for those questions. "Those are all members of the Shakespeare class. Notice the wild roses." "Yes, all who wear that emblem. It's the class of 1912, you understand." "They are the ones who are to pass through the Golden Gate, not around it." "Yes, only they, with the exception of a few belated ones who, in the years gone by, did not reach here to go with their class. Only one passage through that gateway, so you see it is a golden day in life's history. A little like a wedding day, isn't it? The marriage service standing for the entrance into a new name and home." "Or like the gateway to heaven," Hazel said, her lips parted in eager delight, and her cheeks aglow. "We pass through that gateway but once, you know." He felt no disposition to laugh, or to make a semi-sarcastic remark such as Eureka would surely have received, had her spoken thoughts run in any such channel. It seemed an entirely simple and natural thing for this young girl to refer to that one event which by common consent had been tabooed in polite society, as, not the gloomy and dreaded end of life, but the gateway to home. Was she different in this, as in everything else, from other girls? "Oh, they are singing," said Hazel. "What is it? The tune is lovely." As they sang they marched. The multitude representing the class of 1912 passed through the Golden Gate with quick, triumphant tread, passed under the first and second arches, while the little flower girls massed on either side of the walk literally lined their pathway with flowers. "How lovely!" said Hazel again. "How perfectly lovely! I wish I could hear the words that the choir is singing." Her companion thrust a hand into some pocket and produced therefrom a printed program of the day's exercises, pointing to the song that was ringing through the flower-perfumed air. A song of to-day. Sing paeans over the past, we bury the dead years tenderly, to find them again in eternity, all safe in its circle vast. Sing paeans over the past. Farewell, farewell to the old. Beneath the arches and one by one, from sun to shade and from shade to sun, we pass, and the years are told. Farewell, farewell to the old. And hail, all hail to the new. The future lies like a world new born, all steeped in sunshine and mists of morn, and arched with a cloudless blue. All hail to the new. All things are yours. The spoil of nations, the arts sublime, that arch the ages from oldest time, the word that forever aye endures, all things are yours. Arise and conquer the land. Not one shall fail in the march of life, not one shall fall in the hour of strife, who trusts in the Lord's right hand. Arise and conquer the land. The Lord shall sever the sea, and open a way in the wilderness, to faith that follows, to feet that press, on into the great To Be. The Lord shall sever the sea. Burnham watched the girl as she read the words. They were moving forward with the crowds, keeping time instinctively to the music, but she read every word. "Aren't they wonderful?" she said, as the last note of the song died away. "I feel as though I had never before heard such words." "It is poetry, all right," Burnham said. "There are a number by the same writer in the book used here. Copyrighted, you see, evidently written for the occasion, and all with the ring of true poetry." "Lathbury," read Hazel, referring to her program. "M.A. Lathbury. I must remember that name. I want to read every line that writer ever wrote. The Lord shall sever the sea, and open a way in the wilderness. I am afraid, Mr. Roberts, you will think me almost sacrilegious, but do you know I can't help feeling that that is just what he has done for me. You will not understand it, of course, but oh, I was in the wilderness, and there didn't seem any way out. He must have done it." Burnham Roberts had no reply. Tears were shining in the eyes of the young enthusiast. He feared that she could not see his look of sympathy, but the words he wanted to speak he knew were not suited for that time and place. "Watch the class filing into the hall," he said, trying to speak in a commonplace tone. "See what a large representation they have here. They are from all over the country. I am told that there are 25 states represented by this one class. That means a pretty wide-reaching influence, doesn't it?" "Who are the ones who are already seated before the class arrived?" Hazel questioned. They had reached the hall by that time, and were standing where they could command a full view. "They are all members of the C.L.S.C. Haven't you seen and heard those cabalistic letters everywhere for the last few days? They represent the one great reading circle of which all these people are members; the graduates of the years past and the would-be graduates of the years to come. Notice the class flowers, especially the pansies. That's the aggressive class this year, the '87s. That is their banner in the corner nearest you, the one with the pansy on it. They think it the handsomest banner here, and I'm not sure but they're right." "Neglect not the gift that is in thee," read Hazel from the banner. "Yes, that's their class motto. They certainly are not neglecting it this year. They are everywhere in evidence. It is an anniversary with them of what? 1887, 1912. Why, the 25th, of course. Ah, that's the reason they are so aggressive. They even have a class breakfast to-morrow morning. Stebbins is in a flutter of preparation for it. He is my college friend I told you of, and it's his class." "Do college men belong to these classes?" "Oh, yes, indeed, and college women, scores of them. Stebbins is enthusiastic over the whole thing. He says the books represent modern thought and scientific conclusions and all the rest of it in the best possible language, and besides being well worth reading for themselves, the scheme affords boundless opportunities for helping others. Stebbins is a great fellow for helping." Hazel was gazing about her while she questioned and listened, intently interested in everything. "There is an army of people wearing oak leaves," she said. "No flower at all, just a leaf. What can that mean?" "They are the undergraduates, whose honors are yet to come. The 1913, you see, and all the rest of them. The class of 1916 is forming here this season. It is a 4 years' course, you understand. You and I ought to join that class, Hazel, and go through the Golden Gate in 4 years from now. Shall we?" There was a heightened color on the girl's face. He had never before called her Hazel, but of course he would, now that she was in his mother's employ. She fell in promptly with what she believed to be his mood. "I think so," she said gaily. "I have already been made Queen Wilhelmina this morning, and Marjorie has arranged that this afternoon I am to be Tennyson's Maud. Fancy that little mouse knowing Tennyson's Maud! So you see I am prepared to play anything to day. There are my cousins wearing oak leaves." "Indeed," said Burnham. "Kindly point them out to me. Where are they sitting? They must have joined the class of 1916. Does that make you more or less willing to do so? I mean, are your cousins as pronounced in their views as your aunt seems to be?" Hazel was glad that she need make no reply. She was not sure just how she felt toward her cousins. Now that she was away from them, she realized more than she had before that they had tried to be kind; that often her own dreariness had pushed from herself little kindnesses that they were ready to offer; and that even her aunt had perhaps been more often solicitous for her real good than she had received credit for being. The question that was beginning to haunt Hazel was, could she cultivate a different feeling for these her only relatives, a feeling that would last when that sorrowful day arrived in which she must return to them? Of course Mr. Roberts could not understand any of this, and must not hear about it. She was glad that the great assembly had again burst into song. Burnham, in answer to her questioning eyes, quietly pointed out the words on the program. "A sound is thrilling through the trees, and vibrant through the air. 10,000 hearts turn hitherward, and greet us from afar. And through the happy tide of song that blends our hearts in one, the voices of the absent flow in tender undertone. Fair wisdom builds her temple here, her 7-pillared dome. Toward all the lands she spreads her hands, and greets her children home. Not all may gather at her shrine to sing of victories won. Their names are graven on her walls. God bless them, every one. Hazel's eyes were shining through a mist of tears. "It is all so beautiful," she said, responding to her companion's sympathetic and inquiring glance. "It must come home to the hearts of so many hungry people. They are middle-aged, a good many of them. They are having things that they missed in their youth. Besides, there must be people at home, perhaps older than these, who are parts of the same circle, and included in the prayer, 'God bless them, every one.' Don't you think that this touching poem is very nearly the most beautiful thing that the Bishop has done in his long, beautiful life?" It was much the same thought that Eureka had expressed but a short time before, when Burnham Roberts had listened with an amused smile and a disposition to rally her upon her "streak of sentimentality." He felt no such desire now. On the contrary, it seemed to him a happy and expressive way of voicing his own feeling. There was no time for response, the Bishop was speaking. "Members of the Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle, representatives of the class of 1912, dearly beloved. You have finished the appointed course of reading, you have been admitted to the Grove, you have passed under the arches dedicated to history, literature, science and faith, you have been admitted to the hall in the Grove, and now as Chancellor of the Chautauqua Institution, I greet you and announce that you are approved graduates of the CLSC and entitled to membership in the Society of the Hall in the Grove. The Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face to shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace." Following this official recognition came the CLSC flag with its painting of the hall as it was in the early days, and its Chautauqua emblems, the open Bible and the cross of Christ. During the giving of certain class notices, Burnham Roberts fell to whispering. "That man who described the flag and explained the tablets has been here ever since there was a Chautauqua. My mother met him here, when she and her 3 friends came as girls. You know which ones I mean, do you not? We call them the 4 girls. They had some unique experiences here, and some impressions were made that have lasted. This man was one of the teachers and lecturers at that time. My mother remembers him perfectly. Some of his teachings she says she is living by." "They must have been wonderful teachings," murmured Hazel. The feeling that she had for this young man's mother she could not have put into words. "And here he is teaching yet," she added. "He looks and speaks as though this class might expect him to attend their 25th anniversary." "He is Dr. Jesse Lyman Hurlbut," explained Burnham in his capacity of general informer. "Oh, I know him," whispered back his audience. "I shall remember him forever. One night, only a few weeks ago, but it seems like ages, I was passing this very hall, and this man was talking. I was, oh, so miserable, and do you know, his voice reached me just in time. He will never know it here, but I shall tell him about it some day when I meet him in heaven. What he saved me from that night." Then they had to listen again, for the Bishop was dedicating the class tablets. "This mosaic tablet, as a memorial of the class of 1912, we hereby place in this hall as a part of its lasting pavement, and as a feature of its decoration. May they whose feet tread this pavement stand firmly on the rock of ages, and dwell forever within the walls of the eternal city that hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God." "He never forgets the foundation," Hazel said, and her companion, whose natural tendency it would have been to ask in cynical tones, "What foundation?" had no reply to make. This simple, sincere girl seemed to take earnestness for granted. They were moving now, with the throngs in the direction of the amphitheater, and Mrs. Roberts having been carried off with "Aunt Ruth" in Erskine Burnham's carriage, the young man was able to give undivided attention to his companion. but he had no words to speak. There was a tender light in the girl's eyes, and an assured something on her face that held him silent and puzzled. Why had those few words of dedication so moved her? Was she so constituted that any reference to a future unknown world, couched in beautiful language, set her heart athrob with something that seemed like both hope and desire? He felt that he wanted to make this world such a happy place for her that there would be no room in her heart for that other one. But he had a miserable feeling that he should fail. She interrupted his thoughts. She had not even noticed his silence. "Isn't it a blessed thing," she said earnestly, "that a place like Chautauqua was developed, and is being sustained by a man whose feet are set firmly on that Rock of Ages? It might so easily have developed into a mere place of amusement, or into a mere gathering of scholars for literary and scientific studies. But he went deeper, and planted it on the only lasting rock. I am so glad." He tried to smile at her enthusiasm, and to rally her. "You use that word 'mere' in rather startling connections. A mere gathering of scholars. There are multitudes, you know, who consider that the great foundation; and there are those who contend that Chautauqua, to-day, stands for just that, with a little taffy interspersed in the way of amusement." "But it is not true," she said earnestly. "You and I know that it is not. Every one who has been here this year knows better. That open Bible on the banner and that cross of Christ are its foundation stones, and I am glad, glad." Burnham Roberts took his seat beside her in the amphitheater, uncomfortably conscious that she knew on what rock her feet were planted, and that a great gulf separated them. Chapter 21 of Four Mothers at Chautauqua by Pansy. Maiden Efforts. The day began like many Chautauqua days during the season of 1912. Rain through the night, brilliant sunshine in the early morning, every leaf and blade of grass and tiny wildflower a sparkle with diamonds, and the air like wine. A typical day, old Chautauquans called it, the air freshly washed of the past day's soil, with a good yesterday to remember, a good program for today, a good tomorrow to which to look forward, and good cheer everywhere. What else was there to desire? It must be admitted, however, that those old Chautauquans are tempted to call every glad, bright day typical of the place, for they love every leaf of the forest trees, every scrap of mossy lichen at their feet, and every drop of water in the glittering lake. But in all soberness there was nothing about the beautiful day different from 1,000 other beautiful days gone into the unwritten past, yet great things happened on that day. Is it not probable that really great things happen on every day? Mrs. Bradford, as she locked the door of her kitchenette, resolved to put her responsibilities and anxieties all aside for once, and have as good a day as she could find, had not the least idea that its happenings would influence all her future. Mrs. Bradford missed her husband's niece. She was amazed to discover how much. Who would have imagined that the girl whom she had honestly supposed idled away most of her time really managed to accomplish so many things that, left undone, were missed? Had she realized it, she would almost have kept Hazel with her. Perhaps she ought to have done so, anyway. Josephine worried about her. She had seen her cousin several times in company with "that Roberts fellow," and was afraid that it would "turn her head." But Mrs. Bradford did not know how she could be expected to help it if it did. She heard herself explaining to her husband that the child couldn't always be kept in a bandbox, and if she did not know any better than to have her head turned because the son of her employer was kind to her, the sooner she learned by experience the folly of such ideas, the better. Then Mrs. Bradford, seeing in mental vision her husband's troubled face, sighed, but resolved to wash her hands of it all for this one day, at least, and enjoy herself. She was on her way to the Woman's Club. Now the Woman's Club of Chautauqua is an organization that had been a revelation to Mrs. Bradford. She had not discovered it early. That is, she had not known that regardless of her not being a member of a club of any sort, its daily meetings were open to her. Also, it was a recent discovery that this was not simply a literary meeting. Local literary organizations such as she might have joined, Mrs. Bradford had carefully steered clear of, because she belonged to that not small company of people who, being aware that they are not in the least literary and could not take part acceptably on any program calling for that kind of knowledge, yet are by no means willing to have other people discover this fact. The only safety for such persons lies in their having sneers for all club gatherings of any sort, and being superior to those who thus waste their time and neglect their homes. But one fortunate day, just after it had been drilled into her brain that the daily meetings of the Chautauqua Woman's Club were open to all women, the booklet announcing the topics for the season fell into Mrs. Bradford's hands, and she made other discoveries. "Why, dear me, they talk about 'up-to-date housekeeping,' and 'luncheons for school children,' and 'overdress in high schools,' and 'labor-saving devices.' I know as much about such things as anybody. I mean to go." And forthwith she went. One topic in particular, hospitality on a small income, caught her earnest attention. It was a sore subject with her. Perhaps nothing in her experience as the mother of growing daughters had troubled her more than the belief that she could not afford to entertain their friends. Even the small circle of young people with whom they had as schoolgirls felt at home, and by whom they had occasionally been invited to evening gatherings, Mrs. Bradford knew her girls had never heartily enjoyed, because their mother was sure they could never return such courtesies. "We can no more give a party," she had drilled into them, "than we can fly, and you can't go often to such places without feeling mean, unless you make some return." So the Bradford girls, this poor mother knew, had grown up feeling always on the outside of things. They were "always trying to hang on where they didn't belong," was the way that Josephine in cynical moments had described it, and Isabel had responded drearily, "The trouble is we don't belong anywhere. One has to hang on to something." At the Chautauqua Club this mother had learned that hospitality was a matter of the heart rather than the pocketbook. She had listened to the words of sweet-faced, simply dressed, cultured women who spoke of their plain homes and limited means, not as though they were things to be blushed over and hidden as much as possible, but to be looked upon as incidental and secondary matters. Such women described, by invitation, in minute detail their ways of entertaining their friends, without elegant china and cut glass and damask, without expensive luxuries of any sort, and with such service as the astonished lady listening knew that she herself could command. Spoke of it all in its simplicity, quite as a matter of course. To say that Mrs. Bradford was astonished is to put it mildly. She was all but overwhelmed with the simplicity of the revelations and the matter-of-course way in which they were given and received. Hospitality among what she was pleased to call refined people had meant to her plate and napery and trained service such as she could not command, and costly luxuries for the palate such as she could never serve. "Thin slices of good bread and butter and a cup of good tea, or coffee, indeed! Who couldn't furnish such commonplaces even in abundance once in a while?" She thought of the day that Josephine had wanted to entertain 9 girls and boys of her high school class and been denied; thought of it and sighed. If she had but known! She was learning other lessons at that same club; lessons that she could not have described, but she did not realize she was learning. The fact was that she was in a changed atmosphere, breathing a moral air that was altogether new to her, getting new conceptions as to relative values, and it was all acting like a tonic on her whole mental system. New valuations of common things, new ways of looking upon daily toils and cares, new ideas of that word home, new conceptions of motherhood, views of possibilities for one's children within reach of every true mother, possibilities that had actually nothing to do with limited purse or even with environment. In short, what Mrs. Roberts had smiled over as only a parrot-like quotation from a prominent club woman, represented ideas that were beginning to filter through Mrs. Bradford's mind, making ready to absorb the poisonous germs that had long found lodgment there. This morning was the closing meeting of the club for the season, and Mrs. Bradford, who was just beginning to realize what it had been to her, was in an unusually susceptible frame of mind. All about her were women, middle-aged and more than middle-aged, as well as younger ones, rising to say in a few words, yet with evident feeling, how much the Woman's Club had meant to them that season. One said that she was going home to organize a work among young girls, like unto that of which she had heard this summer. Another planned to have a children's play hour patterned on a small scale like those which had been described in the club. It was to be opened in their own back yard, and was destined especially for 5 neglected little boys who lived in a nearby alley, and who had heretofore not been allowed to put so much as their noses through her fence. Another said that she had discovered here how she could use her parlor, and her son's love of music, and her daughter's talent for recitation in a way to win souls, and she was going home to work it up. Mrs. Bradford, who had done much talking in her own home circle, and who was a woman of force and energy in her own small world, dominating to a large extent husbands' and children's home life, had never spoken a word in what may be called public. But this morning she was strangely moved. Why should she not let those who had influenced her know it? They had spoken to her, those women about her, quite as though she were one with them. Earlier in the meeting a woman seated back of her had leaned forward to whisper, "Don't you think it would be nice for us to emphasize our appreciation of our president's reappointment for another year by a rising vote? Of course the management appoints her, but we want her to understand that we wouldn't have any other president for anything in the world. Don't you think so?" And Mrs. Bradford, who had never had a president of any sort to call hers, answered heartily, "Oh, yes, indeed." "Then, if I make a motion to that effect, will you second it?" In a flutter of surprise she had whispered back that she would; and heard herself say, a little later, in a voice that did not sound like hers, "I second the motion," whereupon that entire assembly had risen, as one woman, to respond to the resolution with clapping of hands. Mrs. Bradford was one of them. Her voice had helped to bring about this demonstration. This multitude of refined, cultured women who had evidently enjoyed advantages that she had not, smiled upon her, chatted with her, and asked her opinion. They had talked about home and school and books, and work and church, and state, and life generally, and said almost nothing about money. How could it help but drop from the high pedestal where this woman's false views of life had placed it? Oh, she was not one who would ever despise money. There was really no danger of that. But it was a beginning to be more hopeful that money might hereafter take its rightful place in her thought as one of the means toward an end, instead of the end to be sought at any cost. She studied the faces intently that morning of the women whom she could see. They had ideals, those women; she had heard many of them speak. They had homes to plan for, and husbands and children; so had she. But in what different ways they were living for them! She looked at the fair pure face of the president whose words had more than once come home to her with force, as no other woman's ever had. A sudden resolve came to her, taking hold of her vigorous nature with a strength that made her sure she would abide by it. She rose up and spoke out her thought. "I am going back to be a better woman and make a better home." To her astonishment, almost to her dismay, that entire assembly broke into applause. As soon as the hour was closed they gathered about her, those friendly women, clasping her hand and speaking cordial words. "You made the address of the morning," one said. "Struck the keynote," said another. "I think as much," from a third. "She gave us our marching orders. We must all get into line. After such privileges we dare not do less." Mrs. Bradford's maiden effort received like that. She must live up to it. She wanted to. She looked again at the gracious president clasping hands with the swarms of women gathering about her, speaking sweet strong tender words, fitting each to the other's need in a way that seemed wonderful. Mrs. Bradford had never stood near enough to her to take her hand. She had wanted to be introduced, to be able to say afterwards, "Oh, yes, I met the president of the Woman's Club. She is the Bishop's sister-in-law, you know." The phrase somehow seemed to her to bring her into intimate acquaintance with the Bishop. On this morning she thought of none of these ambitions. She wanted to get the clasp of this woman's hand because she knew that she had been helped by her. She pressed forward with the others and waited. Presently their hands met, and the bright tender eyes rested on her face for a moment. "God bless you and guide you," said the low, clear voice, and as Mrs. Bradford passed on, to make room for others, she felt that she had received a benediction. Josephine was crossing the park, coming rapidly with swift steps and a manner that expressed a decision reached. She saw her mother in the distance, and came straight towards her. She was very glad of the meeting. The conflict that she was sure would have to be met, would be better begun out of doors. "I was coming in search of you," she said. "Are you going home? I'll turn and walk with you. I want to have a talk. I've just come from the cooking school. Did you ever hear of cooking things in paper bags? Yes, just bags, instead of dishes. You put the things in the bag, pin them up, and put the bag in the oven just as you would a pan, or basin, and they cook beautifully." "What kind of things?" "Why, almost all kinds, meats and peas and beans. Oh, and apples. The apples were delicious baked in bags. We had some." "But what's the object?" "Oh, you keep the flavor in the food instead of in the air. Roast meat, she says, is as fine again cooked in a bag; and it cooks quicker, too." "But you wouldn't have any gravy." "Yes, you could. The juices stay right there in the bag, and you pour them out and make your gravy." "Out of a paper bag! I don't believe it," said Mrs. Bradford, the outspoken. "Oh, but it does. We saw her do it. You ought to go to the cooking school. There's to be a public lecture this afternoon on frozen dishes. I wish you would go and take notes for me. You'll get ever so many hints that we can use at home, and I can't be there because I am to meet one of the teachers at the same hour for a business talk. Will you go, Mother?" It was a descent from Mrs. Bradford's plane of feeling; and yet, was it perhaps possible that a better home might somehow include frozen dishes? At least it was the new plane on which she was thinking that made this mother respond meekly that she would go. "That's what I want to do now," continued Josephine, too much absorbed in her own train of thought to notice her mother's quiet mood. "I want to have a business talk. Mother, since I came here I've changed all my plans. I used to think that I should make my living either in dressmaking or millinery, but I've decided that my talent lies in cooking." "In cooking!" gasped the mother. "Yes," resolutely. "I was always fond of fussing in the pantry, you remember, only we could never afford to use butter and eggs and things, but I've learned how to make money out of them. I'm going to cook for other people." "Josephine!" "I am, Mother. Listen. I've got it all planned." Chapter 22 of Four Mothers at Chautauqua by Pansy. New Departures. She talked fast, determined that her mother should have no chance to make comments until the plan was before her. "I'm going to begin on a very small scale, out in some of the suburbs where rents are cheap. I'll rent a little speck of a room and a gas plate, or something of that kind, and first I think I'll make some delightful cookies, such as will melt in your mouth. I've learned how, and I'll sell them for 10 cents a dozen. When people find out how good they are, they will want dozens and dozens of them. Then I'll add tea cakes, or velvet sponge cake; and by bread. Oh, I can make such beautiful bread! Of course it will take time to work up a business, but I've talked with the teachers about it, and they say that it can be done. They think the time is ripe for just such efforts in a good many places. After a while people will begin to say, 'How do you make such excellent bread? I wish our cook knew how to do it.' Then I shall say, 'Send your cooks to me, or better still your daughters, and I will teach them.' In a little while I shall have a nice class started. You see, I really have learned how to do a good many things, and the beauty of it is, I can go into the practice class in the university domestic science department, and keep on learning, all the while I am teaching. Of course I haven't everything thought out yet, but I know enough about it to be sure that I can accomplish something." This was by no means the usual Josephine, speaking with calm, judicial, and often semi-sarcastic manner. She was simply an eager girl racing over her pauses and being anxious chiefly to keep back as long as possible the flood of dismayed opposition which she expected. She was unprepared for Mrs. Bradford's silence, and almost overwhelmed by her first remark. "I don't see why you need go to the suburbs, or rent a room. Our kitchen is large enough for first experiments; and we have an excellent range, you know. It would be much easier to find customers among acquaintances, I should think." "Why, Mother!" was Josephine's exclamation, and again, after a moment's pause, "Why, Mother!" in jubilant tones. "You almost take my breath away. I expected to have to argue with you for a week and then not convince you. But you see, I felt that I had got to do something that might grow into a little help for Father. The teachers here are so nice and kind, and they have given me ever so many hints." "Do you really mean that you will let me work in the kitchen and talk about it to the girls, and sell them things? What has happened?" But Mrs. Bradford did not choose to tell what had happened. She was not certain that she could. Neither did she care to tell what she had heard, one morning at the club, about a girl in Ohio who did this very thing, aided and abetted by her mother, and made of it a splendid success. She meant to help Josephine all she could, but it would be just as well for the child to discover it by her acts. Isabel stood on the side porch waiting for them to come up. "I've been watching for you," was her greeting. "I went over to the hall to meet you, and then missed you after all. I came by a short cut. Mother, I want you to go to class with me this morning, and meet the teacher. I told her I was going to bring you. She is lovely." Josephine laughed. "You are being beset on all sides," she said gleefully. "Go on, Mother, and frivol with your youngest, while the staid oldest daughter remains at home and gets you up such a dinner that you will never want to go to a boarding house again." "Chautauqua Department of Health and Self-Expression," read Mrs. Bradford from the circular that Isabel thrust into her hand. "Exercise that rests." "I wonder what kind it can be? I'm sure I have exercise enough, but I must say I don't feel especially rested. Why in the world do you want me to go and look on at those idiots twisting their bodies into all sorts of shapes? Look at this one trying to reach her toes without tipping over. I must say I have no patience with women who make fools of themselves taking such exercises. It is bad enough for silly girls to waste their time and money in that way." However, she had turned from her doorway and was allowing the eager Isabel to pilot her down the avenue toward the School of Expression. She continued to read as she walked, and to make comments. "It is not the work we do, but the energy we waste when not working, that exhausts us. Humph! Such as she knows about it! I never waste any energy." Yet perhaps there was never a woman who wasted more than did Mrs. Bradford. The trouble with her, as with many other, was that she did not know herself. She read on. "Learn to relax, to let go, physically and mentally, to untie the fuss and worry knots." Yes, I wonder how? It's easy enough to talk. But the tone was less scornful. There was even a touch of wistfulness in it. The poor woman suspected that "fuss and worry knots" were all over her face. Those words just described it. She had done so much fussing and worrying all her life. And it seemed necessary to continue doing it. How else were they to live? Isabel caught at the wistful tone and answered it. You wait, Mother, she will tell you how. She says she has been doing it a good many years, and has rested more tired women than she can count." But the pretty creature who presently broke on their vision, arrayed in a perfect fitting white gown, with masses of beautiful hair arranged in graceful coils about a shapely head, with a glow of brilliant color on cheeks and lips, with eyes that were bright with the joy of living, and tingling with energy to her very finger tips, yet expressing ease and grace in every movement, looked too fair and glad a creature to know anything about real fatigue or worry. Mrs. Bradford's skepticism returned. She curled her lip and murmured, "I wonder if that is the boasted teacher? She's too young to know how to teach anybody anything." Isabel laughed. "Just wait," she said. And it was a fact that as soon as the teacher began to talk, to explain, to answer with ready comprehension and sympathy the volley of questions poured at her, to move that supple body of hers that seemed to have no more weight in it than a cork, and did her instant bidding with an unfailing ease and grace, Mrs. Bradford discovered, what every member of the large class had done, that here was one body that was a willing servant, instead of a tyrant demanding from the jaded spirit impossibilities. It was impossible to imagine either lassitude or utter absolute fatigue in connection with her. Moreover, she could show others how to make aching muscles and throbbing nerves own a master. "You want to learn how to get a good healthy tired that will make rest a joy, and work that follows it a pleasure," she said brightly, as if that was a very ordinary lesson easily mastered. Mrs. Bradford, from listening with an air of endurance as one who had been smuggled in against her will, grew interested, grew absorbed in the genial flow of talk that was not a lecture nor a lesson, and yet was distinctly both. When she came to herself, and found herself standing with the others trying to reach her toes without tipping over, the precise effort that she had so sharply criticized, she did not know whether to be ashamed and indignant at somebody, or to laugh. But fun got the upper hand, and she joined in the hearty laugh that was going the rounds at the expense of them all. After that she forgot that it was a class and a lesson, and that she was a middle-aged woman with dignity to sustain. For a full half hour she did that excellent thing for such women as she, forgot Mrs. Bradford entirely. "Isn't she lovely?" Isabel began the moment they were on the street. "She lives in New York, don't you think? Teaches there, you know. I can go right on with the lessons after we get home." But this indiscreet remark brought one of the fuss knots promptly back to Mrs. Bradford's face. "You talk as though we were made of money," she began sharply, but Isabel was serene and quick to speak. "No, I don't, Mother. I'm talking of a way to make some. That's the beauty of it all. She is going to recommend me, and give me special lessons and all that. You should hear her praise your daughter, ma'am. You'd be proud of her. I'm her star pupil, and she's going to help me get up a class of young girls in our neighborhood. And I'm to go out with her twice a week to one of the suburbs and help with a class of beginners. Oh, I know I can work it up. She says I can. She says I'm just the one. I'm going back home to earn my own living not only, but to help earn yours, and give you a chance to get rid of some of the worry knots, Mother. See if I don't." Mrs. Bradford laughed outright, a merry laugh such as she had not in years relaxed sufficiently to give. The comic side of this strange morning was getting possession of her. "Between you and Josephine," she said, "I don't see that there will be anything for me to do hereafter but try to stand on one foot and swing the other, and eat cookies." "Cookies?" repeated Isabel. "Oh, has Josephine told you? And you don't mind? You are willing for us both to take hold of this work and earn money by it? You darling mother! If we weren't on the street I'd kiss you this minute. You can't think how we have wanted to do something to help you and father, before you worked yourselves to death for us. We both felt disgraced to settle down at home and do nothing. We've felt it for ever so long, but we couldn't plan anything to do that you were willing to hear us even mention. And so we just kept on being unhappy, and growing sharp and hateful sometimes, and not seeing any way out. But after we came here, it's in the air somehow, we knew that we couldn't live in that way any more, and we thought we should both have to go away from home and get work to do, so you wouldn't feel disgraced. But now these plans have come up, and we both feel sure we can carry them out, and you don't feel badly about it, do you? You will be glad to have us doing things that will help others as well as ourselves, won't you? Doesn't it all look different to you? Oh, I know it does. I can see it in your face, and I'm just as happy as I can be." "Josephine," said her sister in the privacy of their sleeping room that night, while Mrs. Bradford lingered in the kitchenette, "what has happened to Mother?" "I don't know," was the answer. "Something has. She is different." But Eureka Harrison's day had no such triumph in its closing. The truth was that Eureka was having a succession of unsatisfactory days. All the more unsatisfactory, perhaps, because she believed that she understood the situation and felt that there was nothing for it at present but to endure. Of Burnham Roberts she was seeing almost nothing, and understood the reason. Burnham was in the midst of one of his infatuations, the most pronounced of any since he and she became intimate friends; and his mother, who still had more influence over him than any other save Eureka herself, seemed to be blind and deaf. She had herself created the situation by bringing "that girl" to the hotel, where all sorts of intervals with her at all hours of the day were possible. Yet the mother seemed to be looking on serenely, even helping on the intimacy by removing from their path what could easily have been made into obstacles. It was unaccountable, unless she hoped by such management to help the young man to recover more rapidly from his absurd fancy, on the principle that "familiarity breeds contempt." In that case she must know by this time that she was not succeeding. As for her own influence, Eureka instinctively drew herself up with a haughty gesture when she thought of it, and told herself that whatever happened she would not interfere. If Burnham had, before this, spoken to her the decisive word that would make their engagement formal, she would undertake to remind him that such glaring lapses into admiration of pretty faces were beneath his dignity, as well as insulting to her. But as matters now stood between them, it would simply be an added humiliation to appear to notice it at all. She could not even comfort herself with the thought of paying him in some way for all this humiliation when the ordeal was over, for she was tired of the position which she now occupied; anxious to get through with it and begin to get used to being engaged. Therefore she realized that she would have to be nice to Burnham as soon as he gave her a chance, because he really had not yet forgiven her for that trying day at the lake and the horrid words she had spoken. It was entirely possible that those words were the cause of this present humiliation. Perhaps Burnham was simply taking revenge for having been called a "dude" and a coward. She could hardly blame him; only she would like to tell him that he ought to be man enough not to make that poor silly little girl his victim. Throughout her thought about it, Eureka kept her anxiety for the girl uppermost. Despite the fact that she thought of her as a silly moth hovering around a dangerous light, she could not help seeing that the light was more to blame than the moth. Burnham openly and unhesitatingly sought the girl. He asked for her without a shade of embarrassment; followed the train when he found she was out with the children for a walk, or boldly planned a trip with them that as a matter of necessity included her. It is true that he had always given more or less attention to the children, and they were fond of him, so that his attentions to them seemed unusual to no one but Eureka. It was in the early afternoon of one of her dissatisfied days that Eureka, having let all the various members of her party go their several ways without her, wandered out by herself in search of relief. Her life had never seemed to her more inane and purposeless than it had been since that day when she called her problem settled because she had decided to marry Burnham Roberts, and compel him to make the most of himself, while she gave her mother the life of luxury and freedom from sordid cares that she ought to have. But whatever the future might bring to her of peace and the sense of well-doing, the transition period was certainly not pleasant. It took resolution to keep her from admitting to herself that she was tired of it all before it had begun. Her wanderings brought her, in due time, in the neighborhood of the hall, where a meeting of some sort was in progress, evidenced by a crowd. Moved by that natural impulse to try to get into a place that seems to be already over full, she elbowed and wedged her way back of the platform to one of the pillars, and leaning against it for support, determined to listen for a few minutes. A woman was talking. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Four Mothers at Chautauqua by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Where two or three. "We shall get quick results from the mountaineers," she was saying, "and that is a matter worthy of consideration when there are multitudes to be reached. Here are a dozen men struggling in the water. Which of them shall you pull out first? Why, other things being equal, the man who can help save the others, of course. These mountaineers will help, every time." Eureka was in line with the speaker, who was a woman no older than herself. Their eyes met at the moment, and the newcomer flashed a sympathetic response for the bright bit of logic just presented, and listened. The girl was drawing a word picture of an old man coming on foot 65 miles over the mountains to beg the missionary teachers to come out to his place and start a school. "Many a time," he told them, "I've plodded 15 mile up our hill and looked over at this mountain and wondered if anybody would come over to us and learn my girls before they got growed up and fixed, and it was too late." The quick tears dimmed Eureka's eyes. There were girls, then, longing for education, who had missed far more than she had; girls whose fathers were eager, but powerless. What a thing it would be to teach such hungry minds as those! Now the audience laughed heartily. The speaker showed her power in quickly changing the emotions of her hearers by a vivid recital of facts. She was sketching the dreary cabin home of an isolated mountain white, who showed off with pride her 8 children ranged in a giggling row before the visitor. "Yes, there's a right smart passel of 'em, and they've got mighty nice names. This one's 'Lizabeth, and this here one is Virginia, and the next is Reno, then there's Naomi, who had ought to come next, but he's dead. The last one down there at the foot has got the prettiest name of all. I named her Castoria. I ain't got nothin' but names to give 'em, so I done the best I could." Eureka laughed with the rest. The story was certainly funny, but the skillful narrator sketched vividly the pathetic side when she imitated the tone of that mother who had done her best. "Names is all I got to give 'em." The girl by the post who was often lonely, even among her friends, felt her heart swell with sympathy for the struggling soul. For the second time that afternoon the impulse swept over her to take hold somewhere at the world's work for others. "If it were not for Mother," she told herself, "I would go among those mountaineers and hunt up some of the isolated cabins and get hold of these women and help them save their girls and boys. I wonder if they would have me when I'm not even a church member? I suppose that girl is a home missionary. But dear me, I could bring some hope into the lives of those poor creatures, even if I couldn't preach to them." Then she listened again. This time it was a story of one of the local preachers; poor, uncouth, illiterate, yet with what the speaker called the root of the matter within his soul. "He doesn't approve," she said, "of having suppers and fairs and fetes and bazaars and all those modern devices for raising money for the benefit of the church. He has heard no talk on that subject, and is not able to argue about it; but by some process that he cannot explain, it has, he says, been borne in upon him that 'them kind of things don't fit.' The young people of his congregation wanted to get up a strawberry festival to help pay for a church clock. They came to get his help, but he shook his puzzled head and said, 'I can't do that nohow, children, not for the church. It's borne in upon me that strawberry festivals ain't the right thing. Not that there's any harm in strawberries, nor in eatin' of 'em,' his tone growing more and more puzzled, 'but ye see, Ye see, it's like Peter that time warmin' himself by the fire and Jesus at the other end of the room lookin' on. Remember? Not that there's any harm in fire, or in warmin' of yourself." A pause, the fingers of both hands plunged into his shock of grizzly hair until each hair seemed to stand erect in the man's effort to understand his own logic. Then a light broke over his face. "I'll tell you children what's the matter. You see, it was the wrong fire." The audience roared. Eureka joined heartily in the laugh, yet she was in sympathy with the native pastor. Her father had been one of those who did not approve of eating and drinking for the benefit of the church. What a pleasure it would be to sit down beside that troubled man and help him to get a clear grasp of his own thoughts. While the speaker went on to tell of his prayer for certain members of his church, "Lord, we've got some members here that need a lot of bracin' up on the leanin' side." One listener was distinctly wishing herself a home missionary. "If it were not for Mother," she told herself wistfully, as though that were the only obstacle. Her mother was there, listening to the stories, moved by them to laughter and, like her daughter, almost to tears. Eureka joined them at the close, her mother and Mrs. Dennis, and committed herself to walking with them before she discovered that Mr. Dennis, the missionary from Utah, was of their party. "Were you at the meeting?" her mother asked in surprise. "I did not know you came to missionary meetings. It was good, wasn't it?" "Very good," Eureka said emphatically. "Those women are doing things that are worth while." She dropped behind, when they reached the sidewalk, and Mr. Dennis did the same, leaving the elder ladies to go on together. "Then you are interested in home missions?" he said cordially. "I am always especially glad to find young women who realize what a tremendous work is waiting to be done in our own country. Not that I am not heart and soul in sympathy with foreign missions also. It is merely a case of 'these ought ye to have done, but not to have left the other undone.' But you should study the work in Utah. That's the great opportunity. Of course every missionary thinks his field the most important," he said, laughing, "but I know mine is. Are you a teacher? No? I thought you might possibly be one of the army planning for Utah in 1913. The N.E.A. goes there, you remember." But Eureka did not remember, as he saw by her face. "The National Educational Association, you know. Utah has been reaching after that for 5 years, and has finally succeeded. I tremble when I think of the multitude of the uninformed who will go there to be hoodwinked; courted and feasted and flattered and rushed about in fine automobiles to see fine views and be told fine stories, and sent home to say, 'Why, the Mormons are all right. What do those home missionaries mean by making such a fuss about them?'" Eureka's laugh was a trifle scornful as she said, "You are not giving our teachers credit for much penetration." "Oh, it isn't for lack of brains that they will be misled. They are busy people; they have to study chiefly in line with their work. They haven't taken time to study up the Mormon question in detail, and there are those among the Mormon authorities who live and move and have their being for the sole purpose of hoodwinking Eastern travelers. They have planned if possible to deceive the very elect; and they'll do it too in some cases. They understand the angel of light business better than any other people in the world." Ever since Eureka had listened to Mrs. Wells, her soul had been aflame with righteous indignation over the whole Mormon scheme; yet she smiled as she asked lightly, half banteringly, "Is it really such a very dangerous ism?" Mr. Dennis gave her a quick, searching glance; something about the question rang false. Was she feigning ignorance merely to see if he could answer her? "Did you hear at the conference the other day about the Mormon church in Boston receiving 77 new converts a short time ago, all but 2 of them young girls?" was his answer. "No," said Eureka, startled out of her feigned indifference. "In Boston! How horrible!" "It is the girls they are after," he said significantly. "Young girls. Did you hear of the Mormon missionary who wove his meshes about a salesgirl in a Boston store on the plea that he was an artist seeking for a model, and was ready to pay fabulous wages? and the one in Portland, Maine, who secured access to its best homes and obtained interviews with young women because he was a dealer in rare Persian rugs that for carefully prepared and specious reasons were being sold away below their value. Eureka threw off her disguise of indifference. Here was one who knew things and could give proofs that he did, who had made the whole horrid subject a careful study for years. It was a chance to learn. They sat on the hotel veranda until the dinner bell interrupted them, she bristling with questions, and he prompt and eager with his answers. "He is a very interesting man," she told her mother that evening. "He knows things and knows how to talk about them. There is some sense in conversing with a person like him." Mrs. Harrison made no reply, although she had evidently been pleased that Eureka had chosen to carry on a conversation with the home missionary. It was late, well on to midnight, and all her friends were sleeping, but Mrs. Roberts still sat in her little private parlor bending over some thin foreign sheets, giving some of them a third reading. She was planning just how to carry out her husband's suggestions. The letter was long and full, giving a graphic account of a wonderful evangelistic campaign which was then in progress in London, especially in the interests of young men. After giving in detail the story of a very remarkable conversation, the letter ran thus: "And now, dear, I am getting to the special theme of this letter. I am glad that there is no doubt in my mind as to how my suggestion will be received. What sort of a life must it be for husband and wife not to be in accord on such themes as these? Flossy dear, I cannot get away from the impression that the time has come for us to cry mightily to God in an unusual way perhaps, for the salvation of our son. 2 nights ago I added his name to the public prayer list here. Pray for a young man in America who has resisted all appeals, thus far, whose father is in this meeting praying for him. Since then, I think almost every thought has been a prayer for his conversion. I have made bold to ask that the time might be now. I am impressed with the belief that this summer is the crucial one. I thought of cabling him to join me here with the feeling that the atmosphere of these meetings might reach him. Then I remembered that it was not atmosphere he needed, but God. And God did not have to wait for one to cross the Atlantic. Still, we know he does work through means. What I want to propose is that we consecrate the boy's birthday anniversary as a day of special and specific prayer for him. Hold that one thought before the Lord all day. It happens that on that same date there is to be an all-day meeting here for young men. I need not tell you for what young man I shall especially pray, and I have asked a chosen few to bring him by name before the Lord at that time especially. Flossy dear, I know you will join me, and get the girls to do if you think it well. Also some of their children, Erskine Burnham and his wife especially, and any others with whom you feel that particular bond of sympathy. Would that we could ask Eureka, poor girl. I know nothing about the Chautauqua program for that day, and I remember that Chautauqua has the name, of late years, of being intellectual rather than evangelistic in its entire atmosphere. Still, the bishop has not yet gone to heaven, and there are other grand men there this year. Beside all else God is there. And, however foolish, to human reason, such chains of prayer as we are planning may seem, prayer is one of God's appointed ways for reaching souls, and there is a very special unconditional promise for the 2 or 3 who agree. I enclose a letter for Burnham, which please give him on the morning of his birthday. This was in part the letter over which tears were dropping. Thankful tears, some of them, that "the boy" had such a father to pray for him. Sorrowful tears, some of them, because his mother had not been as instant in prayer for him as she might have been. Not that she had passed a day of her life without praying earnestly for her youngest born, but she knew that she had allowed anxieties as to the outcome of his friendship for Eureka Harrison to hold her thoughts, to the exclusion of more important ones. Especially had this been the case of late, when it began to seem probable that the girl was to be her son's wife. She would never have put the thought into words, but it shocked her to discover that she was almost thinking it useless to pray for a changed life for one who was planning to spend that life with Eureka Harrison. The foreign mail had been delayed, and there had been but that single afternoon to plan for the concert of prayer. She had found "the girls" in Mrs. Harrison's room, and had read to them her husband's letter, omitting only that one sentence about Eureka. They had been sympathetic and responsive to the call; if none of them had expressed strong faith, she could not blame them. One incident had occurred that she regretted. It seemed that during the reading of the letter Eureka was out on the small porch opening from her mother's room. She had a book in her hand, but she had been dreaming, rather than reading, paying no heed to what was going on inside until her ear caught the sound of Burnham's name. Then she had listened, without a thought of impropriety. Aunt Flossy was always sharing bits of description, or anecdote from her husband's foreign letters, and she was always a welcome listener. So it was that she gave startled heed to the plan as it unfolded in the letter, and sat through part of the talk that followed, before it occurred to her that she was an uninvited participant in a private conference. Then she arose, allowing her chair to make as much noise as it would, and pushing wide the French window, entered and passed through the room, with a scarcely perceptible nod of recognition. "I had entirely forgotten that Eureka was out there," Mrs. Harrison had said, embarrassed and apologetic, when the door closed after her daughter. "I remember now that she went there to read. I don't suppose she heard what we were saying." Mrs. Roberts knew that she had tried to say the right words to comfort Eurie, but she also knew that she was sorry that Eureka had heard, if she heard, and was by no means so sure as her mother had been that "of course she would not mention it to a soul." The name of the missionary from Utah had been added to the prayer chain at Mrs. Harrison's hesitating suggestion, because he was especially interested in young men. Mrs. Roberts had been glad of the suggestion. She liked to hear him pray, she said, because he spoke as one who expected an answer, of course. One or two other special friends who were what Mrs. Burnham called "confident in prayer" were added to the list. They had no fear of inconveniencing any one, as there was to be no attempt at a formal meeting; each was simply to be asked to give as much time as he could, consistently, to specific prayer for that one young man. Mrs. Roberts, after she left the others, had added, on the impulse of the moment, still another name to the list. Chapter 24 of Four Mothers at Chautauqua by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Links in the Chain. The impulse came to her that evening as she tiptoed through her daughter's nursery to find two of her grandchildren kneeling, with Hazel, beside their little beds, and pause to listen to their prayer. Here was evidently one who knew how to teach little children to pray in familiar yet reverent language. Since her coming among them, Hazel had made rapid strides into the hearts of these new friends. The children adored her, and their pleased mothers rejoiced together over her discovery. The wish most often on their lips was that they could keep her with them; and they argued as to which of the numerous family groups most needed her; entirely unaware of the fact that the young man, who often listened to them, set his lips in firm lines and told himself that he should like to see any of them keep her. Never were mother and sisters, or, for that matter, an entire circle of friends, blinder than these. Mrs. Roberts called Hazel to her room as soon as the nursery scene was closed, and began abruptly. "Hazel, I know you believe in specific prayer for others. I want you to join your petitions with ours to morrow. It will be my son's birthday, and we have set it apart, my special friends here, and his father across the sea, as a day of prayer for him. Will you pray for him very often to morrow, dear child?" Wide-eyed astonishment was at first Hazel's only answer; then she spoke timidly. "Are you asking me to pray for your son, Mrs. Roberts?" Yes, for Burnham. His father and I have prayed for him every day of his life, but the answer has not come yet. His father has been led, through prayer, to believe that this summer will be the one in which he will make unchangeable decisions; and he thinks that this week is a crucial one to him. We are going to call upon God as never before." "But, Mrs. Roberts, please, I do not understand. Is there a special thing that you want him to do or not do?" "My child, we want him to give himself to the Lord." She remembered always the look of blank dismay that swept over Hazel's face, and the faltering voice in which she asked: "You do not mean that Mr. Roberts is not a Christian?" "Yes, my dear, I do. He makes no pretense of having the slightest interest in the subject, although when he was a boy of 8 I thought him the most sincere little Christian I had ever known. But he went away from home, among companions whose influence was bad, and gradually he gave up all his old beliefs that we had thought were firmly rooted. I know you will remember to pray for him." Little she knew of the turmoil of soul into which she had plunged poor Hazel. It was almost as if she had been told that she herself had given up the beliefs in which her childhood had been rooted, so sure had she been that "Mr. Roberts" was a fully developed Christian. All her talk with him had been from that standpoint. In the privacy of her own room that night she went over in detail their conversation but the evening before. Mrs. Roberts had arranged so that she could attend the eventide service, and it had been lovely and helpful beyond what had been described to her. As the crowd were moving away she had come upon Mr. Roberts waiting for her. "Wasn't it lovely?" she had said. "I am so glad I heard that man." "Why?" he had asked, and seemed amused at her eagerness. It had stimulated her to explanation. "Because he was so helpful and suggestive and original, don't you think so? One often thinks of the power of electricity, but I never heard the thought applied as he used it. But after all, it almost frightens one, doesn't it? To think of the power we might have! If a copper wire can carry more than 100,000 men, what can a human soul carry when God has hold of him? Doesn't that make you feel as though we had never let God have real hold of us, after all?" She remembered now that he had not answered her, but at the time she thought nothing of it, and had gone on eagerly, laughing as she spoke. "Imagine the Doctor of Divinity playing all day with a teddy bear! Wasn't it a capital illustration?" But Mr. Roberts had said that the teddy bear must have come in before he reached there, and had insisted on knowing just what was said. She had been very willing to tell it. "He was speaking of our outgrowing things that we used to fancy we would always want to do. Just as soon as we got a real vision of Jesus Christ, we find our tastes changing. If they don't, he said, there's something wrong. You watch people and see. If you find me playing all day long with a teddy bear, doing it day after day, with relish, you will know at once that there is something abnormal, unhealthy, about me. Apply that to your Christian life. It was queer, but wasn't it probing?" She had thought that the reason he made no answer was because others came up just then. The discovery that he had no interest in, no sympathy with the vital truths that had been thus quaintly pressed home to consciences, was so unexpected that it fairly stunned her. She did not wait for "tomorrow" with her prayers. She not only prayed but wept; and the tears were bitter; they had a personal element. It seemed to her that she had lost a friend. The garish light of day told all too plainly the story of the night's vigil. Hazel's eyes were red, with dark circles underneath. Her intention had been to avoid the sight of Mr. Roberts, and she had not appeared at the breakfast table. But Mr. Roberts had no intention of being avoided. He had delightful plans for the children. It was his birthday, he told them, and he meant to play all day long. He would take them to Celeron on the big boat for a picnic, and a swing, and endless trips in the merry-go-round, and unlimited dishes of ice cream, and a boat row, and really he did not know what all. Of course Miss Harris was to go with them. Did they think he would undertake to keep them from going up in a balloon or something, without her to help? All in a moment the children were brought from their heaven of delight to the depths of despair. Hazel would hear to none of the plans. In vain Mr. Roberts questioned earnestly. She had no reasons to give, she was simply not going out with the children that day. Norah was to be in charge, and they were not to go away from the children's playground back of the kindergarten. Oh, very well, he said, the children's frolic could wait for tomorrow. Would she take a long walk with him, away down the shore where it was quiet, to relieve the headache which he saw she had? He had something to read to her that would drive away pain. No, she could not walk that day. She was not going out. Would he please let her pass? Mrs. Erskine Burnham wanted her, and would be waiting. But he sturdily kept his position, and told her rudely to let Mrs. Erskine Burnham wait. "Hazel, I want to understand. Something has happened. You have been crying. What is wrong? Have my sisters, have any of those women been nagging you?" "Then what is it? My mother cannot—" She had interrupted him then, speaking with firmness. "Your mother is the dearest woman in the world, and they are all just as good to me as they can be. I cannot stay here talking another minute." She had brushed past him and scurried out of sight. Yet she was almost certain that she had done harm. Mr. Roberts would continue to feel that she had been hurt in some way, and would not rest until he discovered the cause of her conduct. Burnham Roberts strode away moodily, paying no attention to the children's calls after him. All his thoughts were occupied with what had happened to Hazel. When, an hour later, he met Eureka, if he had not been too busy with the other problem, he would have noted that she, too, was unlike her usual self. In truth, she was in a mood so strange that she did not herself understand it. Almost it seemed to her that Burnham Roberts was the victim of a conspiracy. What did they mean by singling him out in that way, a dozen of them, making him a special subject for consideration all day? It was a scheme about which he knew nothing. She had gathered enough from their talk to be sure of that. Ought not she, his friend, to tell him? Yet, what could she tell? "You must be on the watch today, for your friends have all combined against you here and across the ocean. They are going to pray constantly for you all day long." How absurd to go to him with a tale like that! She laughed at her own folly, and then at theirs. What did they imagine would happen to him because they were going to spend one entire day, or one entire week for that matter, praying for him? A company of fanatics carrying things to extremes, as fanatics always did. Why was she so annoyed? She ought to be glad, she supposed. Prayer did sometimes help people; her father had been sure of it. And yes, she believed in prayer, of course. Burnham at least could not be injured by it. And the boy certainly needed help, often, to keep him from spoiling his life by some folly. Let them pray. Meantime, what attitude should this unknown fellow conspirator take in the matter? She could not pray, her part must be to act. Burnham was mercifully free from the subject of his infatuation, to day at least, that was something. She had overheard Hazel explain to Norah that she was to have full charge of the children all day. She herself was not going out. She had sewing and other work to do. What if she, the silent conspirator, should spirit the subject of all this praying away for the day? They might take that long delayed trip to Jamestown, stopping off at Celeron for an ice, and any fun they could find. Why not? There would be a sort of poetic justice about it, they too being the left out ones. Thoughts like these were in the background of her mind while she exerted herself to charm the moody companion whom she had joined without waiting for him to ask her. She waited for him at the bookstand while he went upstairs, ostensibly to hunt a text-book that his sister had left behind, but in reality to read the note from his father which his mother had given him that morning, and which, in his annoyance over Hazel, he had forgotten until now. So, having glanced about the classroom for the missing book, he had dropped into a chair and taken out his letter. It was not lengthy. A piece of paper fell out from it, which he crushed in his hand while he read. I have but a few minutes to write before the mail closes. I am sending you herewith a birthday remembrance, as I have calculated that the letters by this steamer will reach New York only a few days before that important date. I have spent the time that I would have given to writing, on my knees, thanking God for giving my son another year of life, and asking him to mark the opening of your new year with so signal a gift to you that it shall forever after stand out from all the others, a blessed year. Will you think me superstitious, my boy, if I tell you that I am impressed with the belief that you have reached a crisis of your life, a turning point? I believe the Lord has given me this thought. I am asking God if the anniversary of your birth may not be the day in which you will accept his gift, looking up to him for the first time as a son, because you are a new creature in Jesus Christ. Oh, my boy, your earthly father's heart is breaking with the longing to have his youngest born a lover and follower of Jesus Christ. You know the way, you have known it from your babyhood. I believe you have no foolish modern skepticism to overcome. You have only to will to take the Lord Jesus Christ for your personal Savior. A little step, a moment of time would accomplish the transfer. How gladly would I make it for you if I could! I thought as I wrote my name on the bit of paper enclosed, thus making what it stands for forever yours, provided you choose to accept it, how gladly your dear mother would write your name with her heart's blood, if by doing so she could secure for you the gift of God that he holds out to you. But it must be your own signature to the paper, and the call that will make the provisions yours. You can turn away from both gifts, burn mine in the fire if you will, and make no answer whatever to the one who holds out the other, but your father entreats you, dear boy, to accept them to-day. I am beginning to feel that it may be at least in a measure my own fault that you have reached the years of manhood without giving your life to God. With such a mother as yours, whose every thought almost, since she first held you in her arms, has been connected with a prayer for you, and who has lived before you the consecrated life she has, it must be your father who has failed. I see some of my mistakes very plainly. Often I fear I have been stern and cold, or appeared so, when I ought rather to have shown you God as a patient, forbearing, waiting Father. My son, will you forgive me, and let me have the joy of knowing that my mistakes have not been fatal, because you have looked past me to your Father in heaven, and accepted the provision he has made? After reading this letter for the second time, the young man sat motionless, staring at the page like one bewildered, overwhelmed. In truth he was. For years and years, so it seemed to him, there had not come a letter from his father that was not filled with stern, sometimes scathing rebuke. That his conduct had demanded rebuke and censure he did not deny, although he saw it more plainly at that moment than ever before. Yet the fact remained that the tenderness and yearning of a father's heart had been shadowed for him by the critic and judge. Nevertheless he knew, and had known all his life, that, after all, few sons had such a father as his. The thought of his having actually asked to be forgiven gave the young man a strange, choking sensation, and his eyes smarted with unshed tears. But he knew that he must not linger there, he must go back to Eureka, who would think his long absence very strange. It was then that he thought of the bit of paper crushed in his hand, his birthday gift. He smiled a little bitterly. He was not having the kind of birthday he had planned. He wished his father had not sent him money. Of course it was money. He had been given enough. The idea of accepting daily bounty from his father, not only, but unasked for gifts beside, and yet giving no heed to his pleading, was beneath a decent fellow. If he could not do what he asked, he ought not to accept his gifts. He meant to tell his father that his foolish dawdling days were over. He was going back to New York to go to work. At least he could earn his own living at once, and he meant to. But that was not what father and mother wanted most. The idea of a day being set apart to pray for him! What did they want? Oh, he knew! Why must it always be something that a fellow couldn't do? If that check proved to be more than a trifle, if it were even $50, he would not sign it. He would send it back and tell his father he had given him extras enough. Hereafter he meant to earn them for himself. He looked at the name, a name so well known and such a power in the business world. Not a bank in New York but would be glad to honor that signature. After all, it was a great thing to have a name of such strength underneath a fellow's life. At last he looked at the face of the draft. Pay to the order of Burnham Roberts, $25,000. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Four Mothers at Chautauqua by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A conflict with moral flabbiness. Burnham Roberts did not know how long he sat staring at the remarkable paper in his hand, nor could he have described the conflicting emotions that it produced. The income from a small property left him by his aunt, while it did not by any means meet his annual expenditures, represented all the money under his direct control. But while most of his wants and very many of his fancies had been supplied, his father had never in his life entrusted him with large sums of money. He had no complaint to make of that. He was fully aware of the fact that his conduct had not been such as to warrant trust. Especially of late years, since he had reached legal manhood, had his checks from his father been drawn cautiously, for sums to be applied to stipulated purposes, and so hedged about that it would not be possible for the moneys to be used in other ways. Many of the purposes were such as his father by no means approved, and while he paid the bills, he expressed his disapproval in no uncertain terms. The young man could not recall having received since his 19th birthday so much as $25 as a gift pure and simple, unhedged by directions so marked that they had almost amounted to commands. Nothing had been plainer or more irritating to him than the fact that his father did not mean to trust him with $1 if he could help it. Yet with glaring inconsistency he had always deep in his heart below the irritation exonerated his father and more than once muttered, "He knows I'm not a fellow to be depended upon." Yet here in his hand was a paper needing only his own signature to make it worth to him $25,000. $1,000 for every year of his life, without a direction or even a hint as to the way in which it should be treated. Trust bestowed on one unworthy. He went back to Eureka at last because he must. He was dismayed at the length of time he had kept her waiting, and as he tore down the stairs imagined her saying that he must have stayed to get the missing book reprinted, or some other sarcasm. But she greeted him sweetly and proposed that they go over to the morning meeting. "The distinguished Scotchman is to speak, Dr. Johnston Ross. We want to hear him once, don't we?" Burnham muttered that he did not know whether he did or not, and asked what his theme was. "Oh, never mind his theme. I want to have a glimpse of him because his name is on everybody's tongue. We needn't stay, you know, any longer than we choose." As they entered the amphitheater the speaker was saying, "Fatherhood was the earliest conception of God in the world. Divine revelation filled full man's conception of it, and the Lord Jesus when he came infilled it. Father, Holy Father, Righteous Father, he prayed, and these terms give us the true conception of fatherhood. We who are fathers of children are not steadily moral fathers. We make mistakes. We lapse into weakness. Our fatherhood needs to be strengthened and stiffened." Burnham Roberts had gone reluctantly to the lecture because he did not at once see a way to escape. But he meant to escape, both from the service and his companion. He wanted to get away alone. His plan had been to seat Eureka comfortably where she could get a good view of the man whose popularity had made her curious, and then to think of some imperative engagement that must take him at once away. Had the theme been other than fatherhood, undoubtedly this program would have been carried out. Those opening words held him. If his heart would ever be ready for a message from his Father in heaven, surely it was this morning. The address was scholarly, theological, abstruse at times, or at least too deeply technical for one who did not understand the ABC of personal religion, yet it held this young man as no other message concerning eternal verities would have done. "Remember," said the speaker, "that our Lord has belted human life. He has girded all possible human experiences. And he said of himself, 'He that hath seen me hath seen the Father.'" The service over, Burnham got away from his companion, not without difficulty, for although he was manifestly not in a mood to be entertaining, Eureka had a feeling that she ought to try to keep him in sight on this fateful day. She was vaguely troubled about him all day. He did not appear at dinner, and none of the family group seemed to have any idea of his whereabouts. As a matter of fact, he spent the most of the day in the woods, striking off from the beaten paths, and plunging into the deepest shade and the most tangled underbrush he could find. He walked fast and far, fighting fiercely the obstructing tangles and overhanging boughs. Never did the enemy of souls make harder fight for one than went on that morning. Burnham Roberts's whole being was stirred as never before. He threw himself down at last on a moss-carpeted hillside, physically tired but in a mental turmoil. He tried to think clearly what it was all about. Why had he broken away from everybody and torn out here alone? Why had his father's letter produced such a strange effect? Certainly its theme was not new. Both father and mother had harped upon this matter of personal decision until he was tired of the words. Herein lay the puzzle, that heretofore he had simply been good-naturedly bored, able to put it all away and give his mind to other things, while today it would not be shaken off. Well, let him think. Why should he try to shake it off? Why was he fighting it? Why not yield and make his mother and father happy? "Because," he said aloud, "whatever else I have been, I am not a hypocrite. I cannot pretend what I do not feel." He hunted for his handkerchief to wipe the beads of perspiration from his face, while his invisible companion questioned: "Who wants you to be a hypocrite?" "Well, I can't pretend to feel any different about such matters from what I always have." "Who asks you to? Who has said a word about your feelings?" "But one can't act except in line with one's feelings without being a hypocrite." "Oh, what nonsense! Didn't you go exactly contrary to your feelings when you sprang up this morning and hurried with all your might because it was late? Your feelings wanted to lie in bed. Did you feel like a hypocrite because you refused to let them keep your mother waiting? In other words, for once in your life you did what you ought." "Well, what ought I to do?" "Oh, that's begging the question, shilly-shallying, putting off, just as you have always been doing. You've known since your babyhood just what you ought to do. Why don't you act up to your own beliefs?" "What do I believe, anyhow?" "A host of things. Among them that there is a moral law that you have broken, and that there is such a thing as God, who has said that there is only one way for a transgressor of the law to escape, by accepting the substitution offered." It was a fact that Burnham Roberts believed all those statements. He knew he believed them, knew the day and hour away back in his early boyhood when he had felt himself personally convicted of such knowledge; and having been rooted and grounded in Bible theology, not one of the "advanced thoughts" or "destructive criticisms," or any of the "isms" that had fluttered wildly about him through the years had been able to find lodgment in his brain. Moreover, he had had later and clearer proof of the solid rock underneath his early teaching. He had not chosen to tell Eureka that that was not his first introduction to the speaker of the morning; but a single flash of memory at this moment sent him back to the great church into which he had wandered aimlessly to pass away an hour between trains, and to the ringing voice that was saying: "The doctrine of the forgiveness of sin is not even distantly intimated by any other religion." It had sounded like a challenge to the idle young man, who had traveled in many lands and amused himself over the peculiarities of many religions, and he waited for the speaker to prove his point. He did it, and yet did more. As distinctly as though the words were being spoken now, came back their echo in the silence of the woods. Can a man really forgive himself? Oh, if we are morally flabby, we can forgive ourselves and continue to sin again, and yet again. Once more Burnham sought his handkerchief to wipe the perspiration. He felt his face burn with shame. He had not thought of that sentence before, since he heard it spoken. He had not thought of it for 2 seconds at the time. Yet here it was convicting him. He had been sinning against his father and mother, and regretting it, and forgetting it, and repeating it, all his life. He was morally flabby. Other questions asked and answered by those eloquent lips came trooping up to add their testimony. Can an honorable God forgive sin? The answer led by logical sequence to the one way, the expiation, the atonement. The moral man, said the speaker, will have nothing to do with cheap absolution. And, God could not be a father if he shrank from the consequences of sin. Fatherhood was facing this young man whichever way he turned. 2 fathers had removed all obstacles and were pointing out the path. Would the poor soul step into it? But the arch-enemy of souls drew near to thrust his petty obstacles in the way. However you may decide this thing eventually, you couldn't take any step just now. Think how it would look in 2 directions. If you take your father's birthday gift, he cannot help thinking, forever afterwards, that your religious professions were made because you could not, in decency, do otherwise. Then there is Hazel. It will look to her, and to your mother, who of course understands her views, that you are just taking a stand because you think she will like it, while as a matter of fact she is truth itself and will shrink from anything that she believes is merely put on. Petty stumbling blocks being placed before the feet of the sinner. They must of necessity be petty, because there were no great ones. This well-taught young man knew intellectually that the great gulf between God and the human soul had been bridged. The question was, would he stumble, nevertheless, and drop again into moral flabbiness? Is not the bleeding heart of God the greatest thought in the universe? It was another of those incisive questions that memory photographed and flashed out for him. Suddenly he sprang up and made a dash through the pathless woods, as though an enemy were following from whom he had resolved to escape. It was late in the afternoon when he re-entered the Chautauqua grounds and passed around behind the amphitheater in order to escape the eyes of the large audience gathered there. He had no desire to meet anyone whom he had ever seen before. He felt exhausted in mind and body, yet the fight was still on. He had fallen now into the slough of inability. "I can't do it," he had said over and over again. "I can't, and I know that I can't. Father thinks I am indifferent, unconcerned, that I never had a wish to be a different man from the one I am. God knows better. He knows I have tried again and again, and I can't keep my resolutions for a week. It isn't in me to be any other than the failure I am. It is just as that human dissector of thoughts said. I am morally flabby. I have never before owned this, even to myself, but I have known it all the while." It was in this mood that he was getting in roundabout ways to the privacy of his room. Behold, it was that same dissecting voice that was ringing through the amphitheater. Instinctively Burnham halted. He could hear every word. "The Christian life is not a single act, it is an attitude. The kernel of it is just this. I am Christ's, I tie myself up to Christ by every string that I know, and if there is any other string, I want to find it. That is the continuous attitude of one who has looked Jesus in the face and said, 'Thou art Christ, and I am Christ's.'" Burnham Roberts did not appear at dinner. nor did any of his friends, so far as could be quietly ascertained, had speech with him since morning. The last one known to have been in his company was Eureka, but what passed between them could only be a matter of conjecture. She was silent and miserable. The members of that prayer circle said very little, and that little seemed to be an effort to hearten one another. "The day isn't done yet," Mrs. Harrison said, speaking softly. "No," from Mrs. Burnham, in the same low tone, "and 1,000 years in his sight are as one day." Mrs. Roberts said not a word concerning her son to any human soul, but the calm of heaven was on her face. "Flossy has had her answer," Mrs. Dennis told her missionary brother. "I don't know what it is, except that it satisfies her." Yet it was not until the great clock in the tower was tolling out 12 solemn strokes that a young man, alone in his room, kneeling, hands clasped in the attitude of prayer, said aloud, gravely, deliberately, with all the solemnity of a covenant in his manner, "Thou art Christ, and I am Christ's." It was the evening of another day before Eureka, not being in the inner circle, had definite knowledge of the great transaction that had taken place the day before, or speech with the subject of it. She knew that Burnham had taken a late breakfast with his mother and been closeted with her through the morning. She also overheard talk that made her sure that he had cabled a message of some sort to his father. As for "Aunt Flossy," the joy in her face made even strangers turn and look again, wistfully. But the one who called herself "left out" was told nothing. "I am a Samaritan, I suppose, or a leper," she told herself half angrily, half whimsically. "I've a mind to remind them that even the dogs eat of the crumbs." Hazel had departed for Jamestown by the early boat with Mrs. Neal Harrison and 3 of the older children, on a shopping excursion. Eureka had been invited to accompany them, but not being at any time fond of her sister-in-law's company, and at all times detesting shopping, had promptly declined. She knew that Burnham went to Jamestown in the 2 o'clock boat and returned in company with the shoppers soon after 5. She sat on an upper veranda and watched their ascent up the hill; the children marching ahead laden with packages of every conceivable shape and size, Mrs. Neal languidly following them, having as much as she could do to carry herself; but the 2 bringing up the rear were also heavily laden, yet not too much so for earnest talk. At least Burnham seemed to be talking eagerly, and Hazel's cheeks were the color of the carnations in her belt. They had been Burnham's carnations at noon. Eureka had noted their peculiar hue, and was sure of it. Her lip curled a little as she watched. Whatever wondrous results that day of prayer might have accomplished for others, it had evidently not made a new creature of Burnham Roberts. She was half ashamed and half frightened that this conviction brought a sense of relief. She had not been quite sure how to deal with a "new creature." It was just after dinner that Burnham, carefully dressed and looking his best in every respect, came in search of her and spoke in his usual airy fashion. One good turn deserved another. She had taken him to the meeting yesterday, and he wished the pleasure of her company this evening at the lakeside service. She went with alacrity. Albeit on the way to the Arcade she asked why he wanted to waste an hour of such a lovely evening at a prayer meeting. Hadn't he told her some time ago that he had had meetings enough to last for a lifetime? He smiled cordially and reminded her that people sometimes changed their minds; that he had special reasons for wanting to hear the speaker and special reasons for wanting a visit with her. He had designs on her for the hour following the lakeside service, if she would grant him an interview. His manner told her plainly that the interview was to be special, and she felt that it would be memorable. Chapter 26 of Four Mothers at Chautauqua by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I have something to tell you. Day is dying in the west, Heaven is touching earth with rest. Wait and worship while the night sets her evening lamps alight through all the sky. This was the exquisite song that greeted their ears as they threaded their way among the throng of worshippers at that lakeside service, where earth and air and tender song of mother birds joined with human voices in calling to worship. Yet Eureka, sitting quietly as one of them, apparently listening to the voice of the minister of God, whose message was for her, if ever message was, yet let her thoughts wander from it all, and busy themselves with that coming interview. She knew it was to be eventful. Burnham meant to ask her, at last, in words, to be his wife, and to that question she had long ago promised herself solemnly that she would say yes. She shivered a little at thought of it. Could she? Stop! She was not to go over that ground. The decision was final. There were other things for her to arrange, matters about which she must stand firm. If Burnham had indeed become that new creature of which certain dear fanatics were always talking, she would not have to mention the subject, but as it was, doubtless he had made some wonderful resolutions yesterday which he believed, poor soul, that he would keep. But one new departure, whether he had included it or not, must be made and lived up to. All that delightful little flirting with pretty-faced, innocent girls must be given up at once and forever. She would tell him frankly that he had never done anything in his life of which she was so much ashamed as his continued attentions to that poor little Hazel, and she was firmly resolved to have no more of them. At that moment she was startled into giving heed to what was going on about her by an outburst of laughter from the audience. The speaker was telling a story, and of all stories in this world for a preacher to tell at a religious meeting, it was about a little trained dog in a circus. Eureka felt scandalized. She made no pretensions, she was counted always outside the circle of good Christian people, but she knew nevertheless what was fitting at a religious meeting. Yet she could not help listening. The little dog, the speaker said, had not done his tricks, and had been unmercifully whipped by his master. In his agony and terror, looking about for a way of escape, he rushed to the cage of the great Numidian lion, and squeezed his little body through the bars. A moment of awful suspense. Surely the dog had gone to his doom. Straight up to the monarch of the forest he ran, and that king of his tribe put out his great paw and gathered him gently inside the circle of his protection, uttering as he did so a low, ominous growl to the people outside. The owner of the dog, who had feared for a terrible second that he had lost a treasure, now recovered himself and said gruffly to the lion's keeper, "I want my dog." The keeper looked at him for one disgruntled moment, then he said in significant tones, "Oh, all right, I'll open the cage door and you can go in and get him if you want to." I tell you, brother, you who have fled for protection from the blows of Satan to the offered refuge, remember that the Lion of the tribe of Judah is your protection, and those looking on, if they but understood it, could afford to say to the evil one, "Get him if you can." No one in that great company laughed more heartily or seemed to more thoroughly enjoy the story than did Burnham. To his dignified companion this was an added proof that he was the same Burnham Roberts she had always known. The close of the service was reverent enough to please even the fastidious Eureka. The speaker possessed that rare power over an audience which enabled him to turn their thoughts quickly from the story that had amused them to the tremendous truth which it illustrated. But as they made their way out from the crowd, Burnham referred again to the story. "I want my dog," he said, and laughed joyously. "Wasn't that the greatest illustration? I think he is about the only man who could do that sort of thing and make the point with it that he did." "And he very greatly marred his point by using it," Eureka said coldly. Oh, I don't think so, not for me, not by a great deal. I tell you, Eureka, I don't suppose you know very much about that enemy of souls, what a beating he can give you, even when you are down and out. I'm going to be thankful all my life for that story and the inimitable way in which the application was pressed home. Get him if you can. Eureka, that if is as big as the world." He made only a second's pause, then continued eagerly. "All this puts me into the very middle of a story that I meant should begin at the beginning, and that I thought would be a long one. It isn't, it's very short. I'm the little dog. I fled to him, and he opened his arms and enfolded me. He is Christ, and I am Christ's." What was a woman like Eureka to say to this? She tried to make the kind of reply that ought to be made. She said that she was glad, but the words had a strange sound even to her ears. Of course she was glad, she assured herself. And yet, his story had put a sort of barrier between them. She was a woman who had learned many Bible verses in her childhood. The words that memory flashed at her just then were, "Between us and you there is a great gulf fixed." Suddenly Burnham interrupted what must have sounded to him like platitudes. "I've something else to tell you. Shall we sit here, or would you rather walk?" They had been walking rapidly, and were near a rustic seat by the shore. For answer Eureka sat down. She felt that she had no strength to spare for walking. It was coming, what she had been for so long expecting. "It is something about which I have been for some time intending to talk with you," he said, taking a seat beside her. "In fact, I have been rather expecting to have you talk to me." He laughed as he spoke, but Eureka felt a wave of indignation. Had he expected her to propose to him outright? He was evidently waiting for her to speak, but she let him wait. Then he burst forth impetuously. "Eureka, I need your help. I feel sure you can help me as no one else can." That surprised and touched her. Despite the marvelous change that he thought had come to him, he did not count her out. He even believed that she could be of service. "I will help you all I can," she said, and her voice rang true. "But you must show me how." "I knew you would," he said gratefully. "I knew you would understand as none of the others can, except of course my mother. She has been more than I could have hoped, but — these things must be very hard on mothers, just at first." What was he talking about? "She is such a lonely little girl," he began again. "She really has nobody in all the world but me, and I want you to be to her, well, everything that a woman, especially a young woman, can, you know." Assuredly she did not know. She forced herself to question. "Are you speaking of—" she said inquiringly, and stopped. "Why, of Hazel, of course. It could be no one else. I am sure I have shown you all plainly enough what I meant." Then she found her voice. "Just what do you mean, Burnham? I confess that I do not understand." He looked at her as one bewildered. "You too!" he said. "Do you mean it, Eureka? What could I mean but that I'm going to make Hazel Harris my wife just as soon as I can?" She could not help her lip curling a little as she spoke with spirit. "You might have meant much less than that, for all that any of us could know. Remember that you have been on terms of intimacy with lonely little girls before." "Never," he said positively, "not in this way. Oh, I have been a fool, if that is what you mean. I have raved over girls to you and mother, and ran after them. I don't excuse myself. I have been an unmitigated fool. But I never for 5 seconds thought of marrying one of them, and they knew it. I never spoke a word of love to any other girl in my life, or tried to make her think by my actions that I loved her. I was with them just as I have been with you, only you and I are closer friends than any of them ever were, and imagine people misunderstanding our friendship." Uppermost in Eureka's heart at that moment was the hope that he would never by any chance discover how utterly she had misunderstood. He went on eagerly. Those friendships were long ago, anyhow. They seem ages ago to me. Since you and I have been close friends, chums, you know, I haven't cared for any other friendships. And I never loved any woman in my life except Mother, until I met Hazel." They talked long, sitting there until darkness gathered, and after that walking slowly down the nearly deserted avenue toward the hotel. He told her of his hopes and plans, not fully matured, but glowing before him in the hazy distance; of what he wanted her to say to people who needed to know things, and to decline to say to those who had no right to ask; and above all, to be to Hazel just the shield and escape and help that a young girl needed. "As if you were her sister, you know. The child never had a sister." Eureka listened and questioned and promised, entering into the spirit of his mood as best she could, and apparently to his entire satisfaction. Arrived at the hotel, she went straight to Mrs. Roberts, who was standing in the doorway of her own room, and bending, kissed her lovingly as she whispered: "Aunt Flossy, I want to be the first to congratulate you." Mrs. Roberts reached up to return the kiss, speaking quickly: "Oh, has he told you? You kept his secret well, dear. I did not know. I did not dream of any such thing." And Eureka, who knew what this mother had feared, felt that the joy of discovering her fear to be mistaken swallowed up some of the mother ache over the certainty that she was never again to be the first in her son's life. There was still Hazel to be met, and the girl dreaded it. What was the first thing to be said to her? It arranged itself. She was flying along the hall, getting to the privacy of her own room, for her mother was still lingering below stairs with a group of friends, when she came face to face with the girl and her lover. "Eureka," he called as she was passing them, "wait, come back. I am just telling Hazel that you are the first, the very first one, to be told our secret, and the only one to whom I shall volunteer confidences." Something must be said, and Eureka had no words. She bent and kissed the girl on both glowing cheeks, then put both arms about her, lovingly, and kissed her again. "There," she said, "tomorrow I'll say words," and fled. She heard Burnham's joyous laugh. He was satisfied. At last, in her room alone with the door locked, she tossed off her wrap, pushed the window higher, and said aloud, deliberately: "Hazel Harris Roberts. It sounds better than the other." And the uppermost feeling in the heart of this young girl was relief. She had escaped the consequences of her own decisions. Blessed are those who, having made solemn decisions without other guidance than their own, escape from their consequences in time. The next few days proved to be some of the strangest, the busiest, and in certain respects the most eventful of Eureka Harrison's checkered life. Among other things, she found herself the very center of the not small circle of friends that had been shaken to its center by the announcement of Burnham Roberts's engagement. Those who had looked upon it as a settled matter that he was to marry Eureka Harrison, were amazed at discovering her to be the closest confidential friend, not only of himself, but of the lady of his choice. From being looked upon by certain ones with disfavor, as a girl who was carrying a very doubtful friendship to an extreme that she must know would make unpleasant gossip and cause discomfort to her friends, and by others as a foolish young woman who refused to be counseled, and was heaping to herself unhappiness that they were free to declare she would richly deserve, she became the hopeful subject of all sorts of information that they were eager to secure, and was expected to join in the outburst of laughter at their own expense. Notably did her brother Neal indulge in merriment and congratulation. "If you aren't the slyest puss! I thought I knew you, but I give it up. We never dreamed of such a thing. Why couldn't you have given a fellow a hint, when I was lecturing you that day for all I was worth?" Eureka, as she listened and smiled and made what reply she could, rejoiced that neither Neal nor his wife would ever have to know why she had given him no hint. One of her unique experiences grew out of what she called a family tryout. The scheme was Burnham's own. "Don't you think I am right, Eureka?" he had called, as she was passing the corner where he and Hazel stood talking. "I'm insisting that this child should explain matters to her aunt before I call upon her formally. It isn't the thing to spring a fellow upon her without any warning, now is it? She may not even know of my existence." "But I don't know how to do it," was Hazel's shamefaced response. "There is no chance in that cottage to see Aunt Sarah alone for a moment. If I could get her away somewhere—" Burnham caught at the words. "All right, let's get her away. We'll go out for a drive. Let's go this afternoon. There's a splendid new turnout at the stables that I'd like an excuse for trying. We'll bring up at the Thompson house in Mayville in time for dinner. I'll phone them right away to give us a separate table. It's a capital place to dine. Stebbins and I have tried it several times. Never found better service anywhere. Let's see, there'll be 5 of us. Mother and Eureka and your aunt, besides you and me." Eureka's protest that she was not needed, and would be one too many, was promptly overruled. Hazel was already learning to depend upon her in emergencies, and Burnham explained that the liveryman would be deeply grieved. Part of the charm of the new outfit lay in the fact that the seats had been planned for 3 occupants. In undertone he added, "I want you along to sustain my mother." It is doubtful if even Hazel appreciated the flutter of satisfaction in which her aunt made ready for that eventful drive. She did not fail to make careful explanations to her neighbor, Mrs. Adams, as they lunched together at the Arlington. "I can't be at the 5 o'clock lecture. I'm going to drive with Mrs. Evan Roberts." "Oh, yes, my niece is still with her. They think the world of her. I told her last week that the next thing I knew she would be deserting us altogether and going to live with them." Little did Mrs. Bradford imagine how true were the words spoken in sarcasm. The stream of information flowed on. "My daughters will have to eat their dinner in solitude tonight. We are to dine at the Thompson house in Mayville. Have you heard what a very fine house that is? Really exceptional, I am told. But I suppose dining there is just a little device for giving dear Mrs. Roberts and myself a quiet hour together. We live in such a whirl here that there is really no time for social functions." Apparently, however, Burnham Roberts was not planning for that "quiet hour." He seated Hazel in the back seat beside his mother, and placed Mrs. Bradford in front with Eureka and himself; and those two, both of them adepts at entertaining others when they chose, exerted themselves to the utmost to give the good lady a happy afternoon. When, after a delightful drive along the lake front, they finally drew up before the Thompson house, Mrs. Bradford's eyes were bright and there was a becoming color in her somewhat jaded face. She had never in her life before rode in so fine a turnout, nor been so charmingly deferred to and entertained. It was after the excellent dinner was concluded and they had gone to the veranda to view the sunset, that Hazel called her aunt to the farther end of it to look at an ambitious vine which was climbing to the second story, and forgetting it entirely when they reached it, began breathlessly: "Aunt Sarah, I have something to tell you that I think will surprise you very much. I have promised, that is, Aunt Sarah, I am engaged to be married." "The idea!" said Mrs. Bradford, startled out of her eagerness to make quick work with the vine and get back to Mrs. Roberts. "What do you mean? Whom have you found so soon that you think wants to marry you? Child, you are too young to talk about such things. What do you suppose your uncle would say to such nonsense? Do they know, I mean the Robertses, what you are up to?" "Yes," said Hazel, with a nervous little laugh. "Oh, yes, they know." "And what do they say? Do they know him, the fellow, and is he decent?" "Aunt Sarah!" "Well, such questions have to be asked, I can tell you, if there's anything to it. Your uncle will never in the world consent to your marrying some worthless fool of a boy who can't support a wife. What's his name? Where does he live?" "Aunt Sarah, it is Mr. Roberts." "What! Who is? You don't say he's got the same name as the family? Is he their hired man? What are you talking about, anyway? Why can't you tell a straight story?" "It is Mr. Roberts himself, Aunt Sarah, Mr. Burnham Roberts, the one who brought us out here to-day." But at this point the look on her aunt's face was too much for Hazel. She broke into hysterical laughter, and was very near to tears, and summoned Eureka with a beseeching gesture to her side. Chapter 27 of Four Mothers at Chautauqua by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Memorials. While Eureka explained, and explained again, and listened to incoherent exclamations, and answered what questions she could, and exerted her skill to the utmost to get the good lady calmed down into ordinary speech and manner, Hazel slipped away and joined Mrs. Roberts at the other end of the long veranda. For the homeward drive, Burnham, without asking any questions, placed his mother and Aunt Sarah on the back seat, leaving them to get on together as best they could, while he devoted himself exclusively to the ladies in front. But he put the aunt into another nervous flutter by saying to her, when he handed her from the carriage as if she had been a princess, "May I call upon you to-morrow at about 10 o'clock, Mrs. Bradford?" Busy as she was during that strange week, Eureka nevertheless found a little time for her own interests, and was amazed when she thought it over afterwards to realize how absorbed she had been in the numerous missionary conferences and missionary talks and even missionary prayer meetings held at the various denominational houses. It was not until she had been to several of these meetings that she awoke to the consciousness that always her escort seemed to be Mr. Dennis, the missionary from Utah, and that they went and came without other company; also that both of them were in the habit of lingering on the veranda or in one of the small parlors for an hour at a time, asking and answering questions, and apparently enjoying each other's society to the utmost. What aroused her to this state of things was the discovery that she was the subject of remark and of curious surmisings. Some of the bolder lookers on began to rally her after the fashion of their kind. Mrs. Neal Harrison, for instance, more bold perhaps than others by reason of being her sister-in-law, asked her outright when she expected to go to Utah, and if she felt very sure that even a missionary could always withstand the temptations peculiar to that state. The coarseness of the insinuation made Eureka indignant, yet it was not those words that sent the blood racing through her veins with such force that she turned suddenly giddy. It was the scarlet hue on the face of her mother, and the very peculiar look that passed between her and Mr. Dennis, who at that instant entered the reception room. Lying outwardly quiet beside her mother that night, Eureka was in inward turmoil. She was translating that exchange of glances between the missionary from Utah and her mother, and deciding that she understood. Her translation fitted in with a remark made to her by Mrs. Dennis but a few hours before. "Do you think," she had asked, "that your mother would like to live in the West?" The tone was peculiar, and she knew now that it was significant, but she had been stupid. "In the West?" she had repeated. "I am sure I don't know. She has never had any reason to consider such a question. Why do you ask, Aunt Marian?" But Aunt Marian hadn't chosen to answer, and had immediately changed the subject. Now it was all very plain. They wanted her to marry the missionary from Utah. Her mother wanted it, and had been allowing herself to talk over the possibilities with the man himself. What else could that exchange of glances have meant? Mother was so anxious to have her married and settled in life that she would be willing to have her go to Utah or to China, so that she need be worried over her no more. Perhaps Mother was disappointed that her daughter was not to be Mrs. Burnham Roberts. It is true she had always heartily opposed their friendship, but that might have been because she feared that Burnham was simply flirting. Poor Mother! She was very much alone in this big, hard world, and had very little of the world's goods. Perhaps she worried over the future. In truth, Eureka knew that she did. She had nothing to lean upon. The others well, they were married and settled, and of small account so far as her mother's comfort was concerned. Did she believe that a home missionary would be able to support a mother-in-law? Was it possible that Mr. Dennis was really thinking of such things? He must be. He must have talked with her mother. She went hurriedly over the days since she had known him intimately. Certainly he had sought her out, taken trouble to secure a walk or a talk with her. Now that she forced herself to go over the days in detail, his attentions had been really marked. It must be that he wanted to marry her. And, poor Eureka, it was plain that her mother wanted her to marry him. No wonder that sleep failed her that night; and, after lying perfectly still as long as her nerves would bear the strain, she arose, slipped into a wrapper, and going softly to the little porch, bared her burning face to the dews of night. Another terrible problem was before her, and her common sense told her that a decision of some sort would soon have to be made. What should she do? There was no question of her liking the missionary; she liked him very much in every way; and she was more deeply interested in the work about which he had told her than in anything she had ever heard of before. She was sure that she could help in it, even as she was. "And I am not," she began in her thought, and stopped with a strange feeling at her heart. Without herself realizing what had been taking place in her mind during those few strange days, she knew that the evident and very strongly marked change in Burnham Roberts had moved her powerfully. Deep in her inner consciousness this carefully taught child of believing parents hid a firm belief in the fact of regeneration. She knew that there was such a thing as becoming a new creature. She had looked on at transformations, and had learned to scoff and sneer because there were apparently so few of them; so few Christians who lived up to her ideals. These days since Burnham had begun to pray and to live had left her feeling alone and lonely. The hidden thought of her heart had been, "If I had anybody to pray for me as they prayed for Burnham, I might." Then her well-trained intellect had reminded her that she was the child of many prayers, and that Jesus Christ himself was her advocate at this moment. "He ever liveth to make intercession." Hadn't her own father explained the meaning of those words to her long ago, when she had learned the verse as a "golden text"? But the immediate problem was whether she could possibly marry Mr. Dennis. He was a great deal older than herself; she did not care for that. Poor mother, to be disappointed twice in getting rid of her troublesome daughter would be hard. Would he be willing to marry her if she told him that she respected him very much, believed in him fully, liked him better than any of her other friends, but as for loving him, she was different from other girls and had never loved, and assuredly never expected to really love anybody? He must be going to ask her to marry him, for surely mother would never have been confidential with him unless he had gone to her. Was marriage sometimes just a fine friendship between self-respecting people? Would it be right for her to secure in this way a home for mother, and the protection for her old age that men could give? These questions did not follow each other consecutively; some of them were not definitely thought at all; they just floated through her consciousness, hurriedly, like problems that must be taken up if— Morning brought no relief to her perturbed soul, but her nervous unrest sent her to the morning conference on missions, to the afternoon question hour on home missions, at both of which gatherings Mr. Dennis was the chief speaker, and finally to the home mission prayer meeting at one of the denominational houses. Little she heard of the talks or the prayers during that hour. She had met Mr. Dennis at the door, and he had asked if he might take her home after the meeting, and would she give him an opportunity to talk with her on a very private and personal matter. He began to talk the moment they were out of hearing of the multitude. "My dear Miss Harrison, I have really been seeking this opportunity for the last 2 days, and I fancy you know fairly well what I want to ask of you." If she had not felt too much troubled, she could have laughed. Here was another who supposed her to know people's thoughts before they were spoken. He waited for no response, but went on hurriedly. "I have noticed with the greatest joy your deepening interest in the general subject of home missions, and I cannot help feeling that there has been a special interest in my own field. I have sometimes hoped that you would like to live in the region where my work lies, and I am sure that you would take the greatest possible interest in the young women we are trying to reach." There was a pause as if for reply, but Eureka felt that she could not have spoken a word to have saved his life. He cleared his voice ever so gently, and went on. "In short, my dear Eureka, I may call you Eureka, may I not? I have dared to hope that you would help me to reestablish my broken home, and to be to us all, to my children especially perhaps, the friend we all need." Still was Eureka tongue-tied. This was so utterly unlike the way she had imagined he might speak, that there seemed no place for her words. But he did not wait this time for response. "I think I can realize to some extent how your mother feels about this, knowing as she does that you gave up your dearest hopes for her, and feeling sure as she does that whatever arrangements in life you might make, she would be always your first thought. Of course she thinks first of you. But I have ventured the hope that, so far from my putting an obstacle in the way of your care for her, you would be willing to trust me to do everything for her comfort and happiness that a man could do. Not only that, but we have both hoped that you would be willing to come and help us make a united home, and work with us for other homes that Satan has despoiled. Have I presumed upon my knowledge of your real character, may I say, daughter?" Once more in the solitude of her room, her mother having been left with Mr. Dennis on the porch below, Eureka locked her door, drew down her shades, and dropped into the first chair she saw. Then she laughed. Not bitterly, not gloomily; just a free hearty laugh with a touch of relief in it. The tremendous tension of the day was over at last, and she could afford the reaction. "To be refused twice in 1 week is too much," she said aloud, and laughed again. "Eureka Harrison, you would do well to stop planning other people's lives for them, and give yourself to being thankful that you are to be allowed to remain Eureka Harrison to the end of the chapter. May I say, daughter? Think of it! Oh, mother, mother! But I shall go to Utah all the same, and help some of those girls. See if I don't." Burnham and Hazel were out for the afternoon. The days were very busy ones, for the Chautauqua season was drawing to a close. Only 1 whole day more, and then home, for all the members of Aunt Ruth's party. To several of them the getting ready to begin other homes, and utterly changed lives for more than one of them. Hazel had been left to travel in Mrs. Roberts' care, her aunt and cousins having departed 2 days before, being driven to the railroad station in excellent style, and established in the luxurious drawing-room car with all the appliances of modern luxury about them. The latest magazines, the choicest fruits, and every other aid to comfort that Burnham Roberts could secure. "It is awfully different from the way we came," said Isabel as she leaned back in her luxurious chair and munched chocolates. "I should think as much," from Josephine, as she turned the pages of the latest Harper, "and to think that we owe it all to that little mouse of a Hazel. Doesn't it seem almost like witchcraft, Mother?" Mrs. Bradford adjusted her head comfortably among the cushions and closed her eyes to enjoy the luxury of rest as she said dreamily, "Hazel is really an unusual girl. I knew there were possibilities in her. She takes after the Bradford side of the family." But in spite of the busy closing days, those two had found time for a special afternoon. Stebbins, Burnham Roberts's '87 friend, had invited them to be present at the class anniversary, and Hazel had private reasons of her own for being especially interested in it. They were early, so they wandered into the Hall of the Christ to enjoy its solitude. "It is simply shocking," Burnham said as they mounted the steps, "that you have not been to any of the meetings held here. It is the place of all others where I should have expected you to spend your leisure time, until I stole it all." "I had no leisure time," said Hazel, laughing. "And if I had, why would I spend it here? What is this place?" "It is the Bishop's heart, as nearly as I can make out. Here, I can read you what he wants it to be." He took from his note-book a scrap of paper and read: "The Hall of the Christ is first of all to stand in the center of Chautauqua to represent Christ as the center of all learning and all true living, the key to the true and eternal wisdom." Do you notice that the books in the library here have all of them to do with Jesus Christ? The aim, I am told, is to gather the best writers of all ages, past, present, and as they come out, future books, that bear upon his life and his work. Pictures, too, you know, copies of the great masters. The Bishop, they say, wants one very large and the very greatest to cover that space back of the archway. Somebody will give it some day. I wish it could be us." "Perhaps a great many somebodies might do it, of which you could be one." "That's an idea, a class picture, our class. We have 4 years in which to work it up. Let's take hold of it." She laughed deliciously. She had not yet grown used to the joy of hearing this man say "we" and "us." "It is a beautiful thought," she said, looking about her. "A hall where Jesus Christ is enthroned; where only his story is allowed; told in print and picture and sculpture and the human voice. Isn't it grand?" "We will help to tell the story," he said eagerly. "You and I. Let us begin now and lay aside a certain sum each year that will help to make this building vocal with his praise. Wouldn't that be a good way in which to memorialize this special year?" "A beautiful way," she said. "Burnham, I do know about this place. Isn't it here that the Bishop speaks on Sunday mornings? Well, do you know that Eureka came here last Sunday, to the early morning meeting, and heard him speak some words that I don't believe she will ever forget. Have you begun to pray very especially for one person yet, above all others, one who doesn't know the Lord? Oh, you will. I think it is one of the very first things he gives us to do. I hope he will want you to take Eureka. We can't let her go on alone any longer. Burnham, I want her for Christ, as a souvenir of this year." Chapter 28 of Four Mothers at Chautauqua by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sing a Song of Years. From the Hall of the Christ they turned their steps to the hall in the grove. As they moved slowly through the grove, with the sunbeams playing hide and seek among the trees, and the gentle plash of the fountain, and the murmur of bird song in their ears, the power of it, mingling with the sense of the coming farewell, got hold of their hearts. "What a perfectly beautiful and blessed monument it all makes for the Bishop," Hazel said, stopping to look about her wistfully. "What more could he have done to reach and help people? I wonder how he came to think of it in the first place." "He would tell you that he didn't," Burnham said. "There is another name that he wants forever associated with Chautauqua. Did you never hear of Mr. Lewis Miller? Why, the great bell tower near which you sat on the day that you were discovered, is his memorial. Every time you hear the Chautauqua bells ring you must think of him." "I love the Chautauqua bells," said Hazel. "But who is Mr. Miller?" "A good rich man. A friend of the Bishop dating back to years before there was a Chautauqua. The man whose money made Chautauqua possible. The man whose vision reached through the years and peopled these woods as they are today." "Is that really true, Burnham?" "It certainly is. I've heard the story from the Bishop himself. His first suggestion was a normal Sunday school assembly here, in the woods, for the purpose of training teachers to teach the Bible; and that was the way it began. His money and his faith and the Bishop's brains united, and this is the result. That isn't saying that the Bishop hadn't faith also, you know; but they say he never allows the other name to be forgotten for a moment." "And he is gone?" said Hazel. "Oh, I hope he sees what is being done here." "There is one very beautiful remembrance of him," Burnham said. "Where were you, dear, on 'Old First Night'?" "Were you at the amphitheater? I don't believe you were. I'm sure I should have seen you." She laughed and blushed. "I was not. I was at home in my attic, crying foolish tears because I hadn't a thing to wear." Poor darling! She shall never cry foolish tears in an attic again. But you missed a good deal. The entire service that evening was most impressive even to me, a barbarian unable to appreciate the true spirit of Chautauqua. Still I could dimly fancy what it was to my mother and others who have memories and traditions. There were a few present who were on the ground for that first vesper service 39 years before. It must have been great to them to hear the very same words read by the same voice that rang out that first evening in the woods. "Not the same service!" "The very same, they tell me. The Bishop opened the responsive reading with the words, 'The day goeth away, the shadows of the evening are stretched out.' But what I started to describe was the memorial scene. Do you know the Chautauqua salute? Then you understand what a strange effect is produced by the simultaneous flutter of countless white handkerchiefs. Can you imagine what it would be to see at least 5,000 of them held aloft motionless for a single solemn minute, the only sound in the great assembly coming from the great organ softly tolling out a requiem? That is the way they paid tribute to the Bishop's co-laborer, and to other great souls who put their shoulders to the wheel in the early days of the enterprise. I never saw a more impressive sight in my life. By the way, there is to be a unique salute today. Where is my purple program? Ah, here it is. Stebbins is most anxious that we should help to swell the wave. You see, they have imitated the colors of the pansy in their programs. Yours is amber, isn't it? And at a given moment they are to be gracefully waved. See that you do your part." "They are pretty," said Hazel, gazing at her program, "and they do copy the pansy colors beautifully. I wonder why they chose the name in the first place?" "Don't you know? It is the pen name of a member of their class, and she is here with them to day. Stebbins has given me points about the whole affair. The members of the class are to be seated near their tablet, the one with the pansy on it, you remember? It seems it was an uncommonly large class, nearly 5,000 graduates. Think of that for a graduating class! And there is a remarkably large representation of them here after a quarter century. It seems they have had an indefatigable secretary who has done wonders for them. Stebbins says their splendid aggressiveness this year is due to her. You and I must take seats today, beloved, but just wait until 1941, when our 25th anniversary falls due, and see if we are not in the front ranks." "Oh, Burnham!" Her voice was awe-stricken over the thought of the years, but he looked at her with fun-loving eyes that had yet much more than fun in them. "We'll come," he said. Then they had to stop talking, for the company had broken into song. "Join, O friends, in a memory song, a song of service, of faith, of praise, of love that gathers its fibers strong from forest soil and Chautauquan days. Sing, O sing, for the word shall spring from seed to scion, from bud to bloom, since life immortal the Lord did bring from the seed that fell in an open tomb." Following song and prayer and the dedication of the class tablet by the Bishop came class reminiscences, bringing vividly back the memory of the early days, class history wherein the long and checkered way was carefully traced, and tender tribute paid to those who were of them, but not with them. Class congratulations given by the beloved secretary of the Chautauqua institution, in which, after happy reference to their class history and graceful tribute to their indomitable class spirit, she counseled all loyal members to be sure to return for their 50th anniversary. Running through the entire program like a graceful thread that bound all together were the words of the class president, as with fitting phrase he announced the various speakers, or paid tribute in a single happy sentence to some distinguished guest. It was all delightful to the members of the class, and by no means lacking in interest to mere lookers on. "They do really manage to keep up the class spirit," murmured Burnham. "I didn't suppose they could, with classes made up of such diverse elements and divided by continents." "And years," said Hazel. "Some of these people must have been middle aged when they entered the class. But what I want especially to hear is the class poem." Burnham looked down at her, amused. "Why 'especially'?" he asked. "Do you expect a gem?" "Perhaps, yes, in one way I do. Have you ever seen the lady who is to give it?" "Not to my knowledge. Stebbins, who has told me everything about this particular class that an enthusiast of the first magnitude could rake up, informs me that she is a niece of the lady for whom the class is named. But I want to know why you are especially interested in her." "I'll tell you later," she murmured, for the reading of the class poem had begun. The vision. I saw a goodly company throng up the steps of knowledge, and some were young, and some were old, and some had been through college. But all were one in hope and aim, and joyful glad endeavor, and all had heard the magic word, neglect no gift, forever. A flower each wore, a talisman, the thoughtful little pansy, mixed purples, golden, blue and white, a tint to suit each fancy. 4 busy years they journeyed on, mid treasures of the ages, o'er rocky paths, and rough hard ways, worn by the feet of sages. Then, passing through the golden gate, and arches green, of knowledge, they looked beyond, and found that life was but the soul's great college. The song. Sing a song of summers bright and long, of leafy trees, and whispering breeze, and wild birds' joyful song. A song of inspiration, the vision of one man, of gathering throngs and even songs, great soul uplifting plan. Sing a song of petals, of purple rift with gold, pale amethyst with ruby kissed, and royal velvet fold. Sing a song of years that come and go, 25 filled with plenty, work and joy and woe. But play a note of sadness in measured tones of love, let tolling bell the story tell of dear ones gone above, where searching turns to knowledge, and mysteries all unfold, where arches ring, and angels sing, beside the gates of gold. Then sing a song of ages, eternities to come, when 87 meets in heaven our members all at home. Following the class poem came the Pansy salute, the many-colored banners flashing in the light a quiver of purple and gold. Mixed purples, blue and gold and white, a tint to suit each fancy. Wasn't it lovely? Murmured Hazel. What, the poem or the lady? Both, she answered, laughing. Do you notice, Burnham, that she looks like a pansy? He stretched his neck to look at her. I can't say that I consider the resemblance striking, he said. It is, all the same. There is something about her that reminds me of one. A pansy is more like a human face, you know, than any other flower. Stebbins says this one also is a writer of books. They had escaped from the hall now, and were walking down the hill toward the lake. Hazel was quick with her reply. Oh, she does. That is the way I know her. It is why I especially wanted to hear that class poem. You know her, do you say? Well, in a book, you understand, as one knows people who have come in touch with one. I never spoke to her in my life, never saw her face before. But still I know her. She wrote a book called In the Way. It came into my life when I was a young girl, and life was very bright before me. I had all that I thought I wanted in the world, the dearest father and mother, and the happiest home any girl ever had. And yet that book, describing a girl very differently situated, appealed to me in a most wonderful manner, sent me searching for the way, as I had never searched before. And of course I found it. Then, when life was all black before me, when I had lost everything, and was almost in the depths of despair, That book came and comforted me in the sweetest fashion, helped me to remember that no matter what happened, I was still in the way, my Father's way. Do you wonder that I wanted to see her?" "Indeed not," he said. "She ought to know that. It would help her. Did the class poem fit your thought of her?" "Yes, entirely. It must be very difficult to write anything that has to be local in its references, true to the mottoes and traditions of a single class through the years, and not only make poetry of it, but put it into the ring of eternal truth. And she accomplished it. Don't you think so? Burnham, wouldn't it be glorious if this great reading circle that has spread over all the earth could be set to work for Christ? Then, when 87 meets in heaven, and all the rest of them are gathered there, think what a company!" They were by the lake shore now, near the bell tower, in the very spot where Hazel had thrown herself on the grass in all the abandonment of bitter weeping. She was thinking of it when Burnham answered her. "I am afraid they are not all at work for Christ; but, dearest, let us pledge ourselves that there shall be at least 2 members of the class of 1916 who will give themselves to the swelling of that company." "Yes," she said. "Oh, yes! Isn't it blessed that we have the opportunity? In the first talk that I ever had with your mother, she asked me what I was going to let Chautauqua do for me. The question startled me, because I had supposed that I hadn't a thing to do with it. But she asked if I did not know that opportunities did for us what we let them, and that sometimes we just let them slip. That was what I was doing. I told her that I hated Chautauqua. Then she said that part of my inheritance was here, what God meant for me, you know. Burnham, it almost frightens me when I think of all that He has given me here." "Think of me," Burnham said, much moved. "I have been letting opportunities slip all my life. Hazel, let us do as the 4 mothers did when they came here years ago as girls. Consecrate all that has come to us, all that we have and are, and ever shall be, to the service of our Lord." "And if they have class reunions in heaven," said Hazel, her thoughts still lingering with the words that had touched her, "may it not be that the class of 1916 shall become literally, when we all get home, a great multitude that no man can number? But the King can." They had turned and were walking toward the sunset. There had been clouds part of the time, but the King of Day had broken through them and was flooding the earth with golden glory. They climbed the hill to see it bid their world good night. They were among the tall old trees, and all about them was the hush of sunset, and the gentle twitter of birds giving good night calls. They stood enthralled by the beauty of earth and sky. "Sing a song of ages, eternities to come," softly quoted Hazel. Burnham answered with an apparently irrelevant quotation, but they two understood each other. "He will convince the world of sin, because they believe not on me. Master, is that the only sin? No, but it is the crux of all sin. If you can get a man in a right attitude toward Jesus, all other sins will right themselves." Hazel knew by heart the story of that crucial day. She knew whose human voice had been used of God to turn this man to the "right attitude toward Jesus." As the sun dropped away, and the afterglow spread and deepened, bathing all the hushed and worshiping earth in unearthly glory, they two clasped hands, and, moved by the same impulse, repeated the declaration that had been used to anchor one of them to the rock. "He is Christ, and we are Christ's." End of chapter 28. End of 4 Mothers at Chautauqua by Pansy.